He was losing everything. She had everything. And one rainy night changed them both forever. They never should have met. A man drowning in debt, fighting to keep his small garage and his dignity. The only thing standing between his little daughter and a future with nothing in it. A woman sitting at the top of a billion-dollar empire who had never needed anyone. But that night, on a dark highway in the middle of a storm, fate had other plans. What happened next will make you question everything you think you know about kindness, power, and what it really means to fight for something worth keeping. Stay with me until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story travels. The rain started around 8:30, but Landon Hayes didn't notice at first. He was underneath a 2009 Chevy Silverado that smelled like burned oil and old fast food, his back pressed against the cold concrete floor of his garage, a wrench in one hand and a flashlight jammed between his teeth. The radio in the corner was playing something country and sad. He'd stopped registering what song it was hours ago. His mind was somewhere else entirely. It was in the stack of papers sitting on his desk, the ones from Meridian Property Group. He'd read that letter so many times, the edges were soft from handling. Notice of legal action, breach of lease terms. Plaintiff seeks full vacatur of premises no later than 60 days from the date of filing. He could recite it from memory now. He didn't mean to be able to. He just was. The Silverado's undercarriage groaned when he applied pressure to the bolt. Landon gritted his teeth around the flashlight and pushed harder. There was a satisfying crack, the bolt gave, and a cascade of old oil dripped directly onto his forehead. "Beautiful," he said, to no one. He slid out from under the truck, sat up on the creeper, and wiped his face with a rag that was approximately 60% cleaner than his face. The garage was quiet except for the radio and the rain, which was now loud enough to hear clearly against the metal roof. A good roof. He'd patched it himself 2 summers ago with materials he couldn't really afford. It held. Landon stood, stretched his lower back until something popped, and walked to the small bathroom in the back to wash his hands. He looked at himself in the mirror for a moment. 32 years old. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. He'd lost maybe 15 pounds since the lawsuit started. Not intentionally, just from forgetting to eat regular meals, from the low-grade nausea that lived in his stomach most of the time now. He looked tired. He was tired. His phone buzzed on the edge of the sink. He picked it up. Emmy called twice. Mrs. Paulson. Mrs. Paulson was 71 years old, lived 2 blocks from his house, and watched Emmy on nights when Landon worked late, which was most nights. She never complained, always had a plate of something warm waiting when he came to pick up his daughter, and refused every time he tried to pay her more than the agreed-upon rate. He'd known her since he was a kid himself. She'd known his mother. He called back. She wanted to know if you'd be home before she fell asleep. Mrs. Paulson's voice was soft and even, no accusation in it. That was just the fact. Landon looked at the clock. 8:47 p.m. He'd been here since 6:30 in the morning. 14 hours, give or take. He still had the Silverado to finish and a Honda Civic with a transmission problem waiting in Bay 2. "Tell her I'll try," he said. "Tell her I'll—" He stopped. "Tell her I love her, okay? And that I'll be there in the morning." There was a pause. "I'll tell her, Landon." He hung up. Stood there for a moment with the phone in his hand. Emmy was 6 years old. She had her mother's eyes, wide and dark, and always full of questions. She deserved better than a father who came home after she was already asleep 4 nights out of 7. She deserved better than a lot of things. But deserving things didn't make them appear. He went back to the Silverado. The other job was at a bar called Mooney's, 20 minutes from the garage, where he worked Thursday through Saturday nights bussing tables and sometimes helping behind the bar when it was slammed. It paid cash. He didn't love it. He didn't hate it either. It was work. And work was what kept the lights on, and Emmy in school, and Mrs. Paulson compensated, and the monthly payment to his attorney, Gerald Fitch, from being completely missed. Gerald Fitch was not a glamorous lawyer. He worked out of a 2-room office on Penn Avenue, drove a 10-year-old Volvo, and wore suits that had clearly been bought in a different decade. But he was thorough and he was honest, and when Landon had walked in with nothing but desperation and a stack of confusing legal documents, Gerald had looked at everything carefully and said, "They're overreaching. That doesn't mean they won't win, but they're overreaching." That had been 8 months ago. The case had dragged on. The legal bills had climbed. Meridian Property Group had resources that dwarfed anything Landon could put together, and their attorneys operated with the efficient ruthlessness of people who did this kind of thing constantly and enjoyed it. The garage was Landon's, not the building. He leased the building from a property management company that Meridian had acquired 18 months ago, which was when all of this began. His father had started Hayes Auto Repair in that space 20 years ago. Landon had grown up handing his dad tools on Saturday mornings, learning the names of parts, learning the difference between an honest repair and a dishonest one. When his father died, too young, a heart attack at 58, Landon had kept it going, not because it made him rich, because it was his father's, and it was his, and it was the only thing he knew how to do with both his hands and his soul. Meridian wanted the property for a mixed-use development, glass and steel and expensive condos. They'd offered him a buyout that sounded large until you realized it wouldn't cover what he'd have to spend establishing a new location, and then they'd manufactured a lease dispute, claiming violations that Gerald said were either fabricated or deliberately induced, and filed suit. It was a pressure campaign. Landon knew it. Gerald knew it. Probably half of Pittsburgh who knew his situation knew it. Knowing it and being able to stop it were different things. He finished the Silverado at 10:45, covered the Honda and locked up. He stood at the garage door for a moment and looked out at the rain. It was coming down hard now, the kind of rain that made Pittsburgh's rivers run angry and brown. He pulled his jacket tighter, ran to his truck, a 2014 F150 with 190,000 miles and a heater that worked when it felt like it, and sat for a moment in the cab. The hearing was Monday morning, 3 days away. Gerald had told him to get some sleep this weekend. Landon had nodded like that was possible. He pulled out of the lot and onto the dark road. He took the bypass because it was faster, even in the rain. The interstate was nearly empty at this hour. His headlights cut through the dark and the downpour. The radio came in and out. Some talk show, static, a country station, more static. He left it on the country station even though the signal kept breaking up. The alternative was silence and his own thoughts, and his thoughts were not good company tonight. He'd been driving maybe 15 minutes when he saw the hazard lights. They were up ahead on the right shoulder, blinking orange in the rain, barely visible until he was fairly close because the rain was that heavy. He slowed automatically, the way you slow when you see something unexpected in the road. As his headlights swept over the shoulder, he saw the vehicle clearly. It was a Mercedes-Benz. Black, new model, the kind of car that cost more than his garage was worth. It had pulled over cleanly, at least not angled dangerously into the lane, but it was clearly not going anywhere. He slowed further. He could see two figures standing outside the car in the rain. Both were women. One was on the phone, the other had her arms crossed over her chest and was hunched against the weather. Neither of them was dressed for standing on a highway in the middle of a thunderstorm. Landon pulled to a stop behind the Mercedes. He sat there for exactly 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds, he had a conversation with himself that went something like, "You're exhausted. You have court in 3 days. You have nothing to offer except a truck cab and bad news. These people have a phone. They've probably already called someone." Then he looked at the two women in his rear-view mirror standing in the pouring rain, and he got out of the truck. He had an umbrella somewhere. He thought it was behind the seat. He didn't find it. He walked toward them with rain immediately soaking through his jacket. "Hey," he called. He kept his distance initially, hands slightly visible, because two women alone on a highway at night had every reason to be wary of a strange man walking toward them. "You need help?" The taller of the two women turned. She was maybe a couple of years younger than him, dark hair plastered to her face from the rain, wearing what had clearly been professional clothing before the storm got to it. A blazer, slacks, good shoes that were now soaked through. She had her phone in her hand and she was looking at him with an expression that was carefully neutral. Assessing. "Our car died," she said. Her voice was controlled, not scared, not particularly warm, factual. We've been trying to get a tow, but none of the services are picking up. I think the storm has them slammed. It usually does. He walked a little closer. What happened to it? She blinked. I don't know, it just stopped. The dashboard lit up and then it stopped. Can I take a look? She glanced at the other woman, younger, maybe mid-20s, with the same sharp bone structure but a more openly distressed expression. She was the one with her arms wrapped around herself and she was shivering. It's fine, the younger one said, her voice carrying a pleading edge. Vicky, please, it's cold. The taller woman, Vicky, made a decision. Okay. She stepped aside. Thank you. He looked at the engine. Rain was sheeting off the raised hood and it wasn't easy to see, but he'd been doing this long enough that some things were immediately obvious. He straightened up after 2 minutes and turned back. It's not a simple fix. You've got a sensor issue and I think something's going on with the fuel system. Not something I can do out here in this, he paused. You need a tow and a proper look in daylight. She absorbed this. Okay. She looked at her phone. I'll try the service again. You're going to be waiting a long time. Lines are probably backed up for hours. He hesitated. Where are you headed? Pittsburgh, downtown. That was roughly 25 minutes from where they were standing. I can take you. My truck's right there. The younger woman was already looking at him with something close to hope. The taller one, Vicky, was looking at him differently. Not suspicious exactly. More like she was doing the same kind of assessment he'd done when he first saw them, deciding how much to trust a stranger. You don't have to do that, she said. I know I don't. He gestured at the sky. But you're getting rained on. A beat. I'm Landon, he said. Another beat. Then, Victoria. She tilted her head toward the younger woman. My sister Claire. Okay. He turned toward his truck. Come on then. The heater worked, mercifully. They squeezed into the cab. Victoria in the front, Claire in the back, both of them dripping and gradually warming up. Claire had immediately started checking something on her phone, the dead urgency of someone rescheduling a dozen things at once. Victoria sat in the passenger seat and looked straight ahead at the rain-blurred highway. Landon had turned the radio down but not off. The country station was barely coming in now, just a faint melody underneath the white noise of rain on the roof. Thank you, Victoria said after a few minutes. Clean and simple. Sure. Most people don't stop. I watched probably 30 cars pass. He shrugged. Night like this, people get tunnel vision. They're just trying to get where they're going. She turned to look at him. He got the sense she was cataloging things. The truck, his clothes, the grease that was probably still under his fingernails despite the washing. Most people who drove this stretch at this hour were either commuters heading home or service workers finishing late shifts. He was clearly the latter. Long day? She asked. 14 hours, give or take. What do you do? Auto repair. Got a shop off Route 51. He glanced at her. Which is probably why I knew immediately your car wasn't getting fixed tonight. Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close to it. I should have known to ask someone like you instead of the roadside service that's been putting me on hold for 40 minutes. Roadside service is good when it rains lightly on a Tuesday afternoon, he said. Not so much otherwise. Claire leaned forward from the back seat. Do you think they'll tow the car tonight? It's a company car. I have to, Claire. Victoria's voice was quiet, but it stopped her sister mid-sentence. I'm just asking. I'll handle it. Just give me a few hours. Claire sat back. There was a dynamic between them that Landon didn't try to decode. Siblings had their own languages. He'd had a brother once, briefly. That was a different story. He drove. The rain was still heavy, but his wipers were keeping up. Pittsburgh's distant lights were starting to appear through the weather. I'm sorry, Victoria said. Not to him. She was looking at her sister in the rearview mirror, but then she said it again, and this time it was to him. I'm sorry. It's been a long day for us, too. No problem. Where were you coming from? At this hour? Work. He paused. Then work again. She looked at him. 2 jobs? For now, yeah. She didn't ask more than that, and he appreciated it. He wasn't embarrassed exactly. He'd never been embarrassed by work. But he didn't feel like explaining the whole picture tonight. The lawsuit, the debt, the hearing on Monday. All of that sat in his chest like a stone he'd gotten used to carrying. They drove in silence for a while. Claire had fallen asleep against the window in the back, her phone still in her hand. "She's 26, Victoria said quietly, glancing back at her sister. "You'd think she was 16 sometimes. In the best way, I mean." There was genuine tenderness in her voice. It was the first time she'd sounded entirely unguarded. "She still falls asleep anywhere. Car, plane, waiting rooms. Our mother used to say she was born tired." Landon smiled. "My daughter's the same. She'll be out cold in the middle of a sentence." He checked the mirror, a habit. "She's 6. Victoria looked at him with a different kind of attention. "Just you?" "Just me. Yeah. How long?" 3 years? He didn't elaborate on the mechanics of that. 3 years since Sarah had left. Not dramatically, not with screaming or thrown things, but with a quiet and devastating honesty that had almost been harder than anger would have been. "I'm not happy here, Landon. I haven't been for a long time. I need you to know that's not about Emmy. She'd moved to Philadelphia. She called Emmy on birthdays and some Sundays. It was what it was." "That's hard," Victoria said. She said it without pity, which he appreciated, just as a plain statement of fact. "It is what it is." He turned his signal on for the exit. "Where downtown are you headed?" She gave him an address he recognized. A high-rise near the cultural district. Nice part of town. Expensive part of town. They drove the last few minutes in silence. The rain was beginning to ease slightly, just barely, like the storm was finally running out of breath. He took the exit and wound through downtown streets until he pulled up in front of a building with a marble lobby visible through glass doors. A doorman under an awning straightened when he saw the truck. Victoria gently touched Claire's arm. "Claire, we're here." Claire startled awake, looked around, disoriented, then relaxed. "Oh." She looked at Landon. "Thank you. Really." "Get some rest," he said. Victoria opened the door and stepped out, then turned back. She had that controlled expression again, but something behind it was working. Is there anything I can do? Can I? "It's fine," he said. "Glad I could help." She held his gaze for a moment. "What was your name again? Just first name?" "Landon." "Landon." She said it like she was filing it away. "Thank you, Landon." She closed the door. He watched them go through the lobby doors, the doorman pulling one open. Then he pulled away from the curb and headed home. He didn't think about Victoria Sterling again that night. He was too busy thinking about Monday, Saturday morning. Emmy was at his feet, drawing something complicated and catastrophic looking in purple crayon on a piece of printer paper. She called it a castle. He chose to see the resemblance. Landon was on the phone with Gerald. "They filed supplemental exhibits yesterday afternoon," Gerald said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering unwelcome information they've been sitting with overnight. "Photographs mostly. Some additional documentation about the lease modifications." "What photographs?" "Allegedly showing that you've been operating outside the permitted use clause. Heavy machinery storage, commercial vehicle staging. Things that, if true, would actually constitute a breach." Landon's jaw tightened. "I haven't done any of that." "I know." Gerald paused. "But they're very thorough photographs. The timestamps are consistent. The angles are plausible." "Gerald." He got up and moved to the kitchen, lowering his voice. Emmy looked up briefly, then returned to her castle. "Are you telling me they're fake?" "I'm telling you they're inconsistent with what you've described to me about how you operate. I'm also telling you that proving that in court by Monday is going to be extremely difficult. We'd need an independent forensic analysis of the image metadata, and even then, we don't have the money for that." Silence. "Gerald." "I know, Landon. I know." Gerald exhaled. "Look, I want you to stay calm. There are still things in your favor. The original lease terms are genuinely ambiguous. Their timeline of alleged violations has some holes I can work with. But I need you to understand that on Monday, we may not be walking out of there with a clean win. It might be a delay. It might be a settlement discussion." "I don't want to settle." "I understand. They're lying. They manufactured this whole thing. And if I settle, they just win and they move on to the next person. Landon, I know how it works. I know exactly what I'm saying. He leaned against the counter, looked at the back of Emmy's head, her dark hair and 2 uneven ponytails he'd done himself that morning. I just need you to know I'm not walking in there ready to fold. I know you're not. Gerald sounded tired too. Get some sleep this weekend if you can. I mean it. He hung up. Emmy looked up at him from the floor. Who was that? My friend Gerald. Is Gerald nice? Landon crouched down to her level. Gerald is one of the good ones. She accepted this and returned to her drawing. After a moment, without looking up, Are you worried, Daddy? He looked at his daughter, 6 years old, and already she could read him like a sentence. A little bit, he said, because she deserved honesty, scaled to what she could hold. Because of the garage? He blinked. He'd tried not to talk about it in front of her. Kids absorb more than you thought. He should have known better. Yeah, he said, because of the garage. She put the purple crayon down and picked up a red one, kept drawing. You're not going to lose it, she said, with the absolute certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to doubt her own convictions. It's yours. He sat down on the floor next to her. Yeah, he said. It is. He worked a shift at Mooney's on Saturday. Sunday he spent with Emmy, took her to the park, even though the ground was still wet from the storm, pushed her on the swings until his arms were sore, watched her eat a hot dog and get mustard on her jacket and laugh about it. It was a good day. He put her to bed at 7:30 and read her 2 chapters of a book she'd chosen about a girl who befriends a dragon. Emmy fell asleep during the 2nd chapter. He sat on the edge of her bed for a few minutes after, in the dark. Then he went to the kitchen table and opened the Meridian documents again. He wasn't a lawyer. He'd never pretended to be. But he'd read these papers so many times now that he'd started noticing things, small things, inconsistencies in the documentation dates. A photograph that was allegedly taken in November showing the garage forecourt with a maple tree in full summer leaf. A reference in one filing to a modification to the lease that predated his actual signature on the original agreement by 6 weeks. He'd flagged all of these for Gerald. Gerald had noted them, said they were useful, said he was building with them. But Gerald had also prepared him for the possibility that it might not be enough. Landon sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The garage wasn't just a business. It was his father's voice on a Saturday morning, telling him which wrench to use and why. It was the smell of oil and rubber that had been in his nose since childhood. It was the 3 regulars who'd been coming in since before Landon took over. Old Ray with his ancient Buick, the Nguyen family with their minivan, Mrs. Kowalski, who didn't trust anyone else to touch her late husband's Oldsmobile. It was the wall where his father had hung a photograph of the shop on its first day of business, 1987. The paint fresh and the sign slightly crooked. A younger version of his dad standing in front of it with his arms crossed and a grin like he'd personally invented the concept of pride. Landon still had that photograph. It was on the same wall. He closed the folder. He thought briefly about the woman in the Mercedes. Victoria. She'd said thank you in a way that felt like she meant it, which was less common than it should be. She'd listened when he talked about Emmy without the glazed politeness of someone counting the seconds until the subject changed. And she'd looked at him, really looked, not past him, in a way he couldn't entirely explain. He pushed the thought aside. He had a courthouse to walk into in 11 hours, and he needed whatever sleep he could get. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well. He rarely did anymore. He was up at 5, showered, shaved, put on the suit he owned. It was a good suit. He'd bought it 3 years ago for his father's memorial service and had worn it maybe 6 times since. It still fit, barely. He'd lost weight since then. He took Emmy to Mrs. Paulson's before 7. Emmy was half asleep, hair wild, clutching the dragon book against her chest like a security blanket. You look nice, Daddy, she mumbled without fully opening her eyes. Thank you, Bug. Good luck. He kissed her head. She smelled like sleep and the strawberry shampoo he bought because it was her favorite. He held on for a second longer than necessary. Mrs. Paulson, standing in her doorway in her housecoat, gave him a small nod. He drove to the courthouse. Gerald met him on the steps at 8:15. He was carrying his briefcase and looking like he'd also had a difficult night. His tie was straight, but his collar was ever so slightly rumpled. "How are you?" Gerald said. "Ready," Landon said. "Or as close as I'm getting." Gerald put a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Whatever happens in there, you fought this. That means something." "I know." He looked at the courthouse doors. Let's go." They went through security, walked the long corridor to the courtroom, sat at their table and organized their papers. Across the room, Meridian's legal team was already assembled. 3 attorneys in suits that had been bought this decade, a paralegal with a laptop open, a representative from the company sitting in the gallery looking like he'd rather be anywhere else and was trying not to show it. Landon looked at them. One of the attorneys noticed and met his gaze, then looked away with the casual indifference of someone who expected to win. Landon looked forward. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered. A woman in her late 50s, silver-haired with reading glasses and an expression that suggested she'd seen every variety of courtroom theater and was not easily impressed. "This is the matter of Meridian Property Group versus Landon Hayes," she said. "Counsel, are we ready?" "Ready, Your Honor," said Meridian's lead attorney, a man named David Pratt, smoothly. "Ready, Your Honor," said Gerald, a beat behind. Judge Marlene Torres settled her glasses and opened the file in front of her. "Let's begin," she said. "Dimatit." The morning was brutal. Pratt was good. Landon had to give him that. He presented the lease dispute with clean, confident language, walked through the exhibits methodically, and made the whole thing sound like simple property management rather than what it actually was. The photographs were large and clear on the screen. The documentation was organized with the precision of people who had done this many times. Gerald cross-examined, pushed on the timeline inconsistencies, challenged the admissibility of 2 of the exhibits. He wasn't flashy, but he was precise. The judge listened with the same unreadable expression she'd worn when they started. At the lunch recess, Landon and Gerald sat in a hallway on a wooden bench. "You're doing fine," Gerald said. "I'm not doing anything. You're doing everything." "That's how this works." Gerald opened his briefcase and pulled out a sandwich, apparently the result of advanced planning. He offered half to Landon. Landon shook his head. "Eat something." "I can't." Gerald ate his half and didn't push it. The photograph with the summer foliage, Torres noticed. "She didn't say anything, but I saw her make a note when I brought it up. That matters." "Is it enough?" Gerald chewed, swallowed. "We'll see." They went back in. The afternoon session started. That was when things began to come apart, not for Landon, but for Meridian. It started with a question from Judge Torres herself, directed at Pratt. She asked him to walk through the chain of custody for the photographic exhibits, how they were obtained, who had authenticated them, what verification process had been used. Pratt answered smoothly. But the judge pressed. She asked for the original metadata documentation. Pratt's paralegal began typing. There was a brief sidebar among the Meridian team, quiet enough that Landon couldn't hear it, but he could read the body language. Something wasn't where it was supposed to be. Gerald was watching the same thing. He was very still, which Landon had learned was what Gerald looked like when he was paying maximum attention. The judge made another note. Then she asked about the lease modification document that predated Landon's signature. "Counsel," she said to Pratt, "can you explain the discrepancy in the dates on Exhibit 14? Pratt looked at the document. He said something about administrative filing delays, standard practice, nothing unusual. His voice was confident, but he was moving slightly faster than before. Torres looked at him over her glasses. "The modification is dated 6 weeks prior to Mr. Hayes' signature on the underlying lease. That seems unusual to me." "Your Honor, if I may," "You may, counsel. Take your time." There was a silence that lasted several seconds. In the gallery, the Meridian representative had taken out his phone and was typing something with intense focus. Landon looked at Gerald. Gerald looked straight ahead. But Landon saw, for the first time that morning, something that might have been the beginning of something like hope move across his lawyer's face. He sat in that courtroom for 4 more hours. He heard legal arguments he only partially understood. He watched Gerald push, question, and challenge with a methodical patience that he would think about for years afterward. He watched Judge Torres make notes and ask questions, and look at documents with the kind of attention that made Meridian's attorneys progressively less comfortable. The session was not finished that day. Torres called a recess until Wednesday, citing the need to review the contested exhibits. The room began to clear. Landon sat at the table for a moment after everyone else had stood. His ears were ringing slightly, the way they did when he'd been concentrating intensely for too long. Gerald sat next to him. "You okay?" "Yeah." He looked up at the ceiling. "What just happened?" "Something shifted." Gerald said it carefully, not wanting to overpromise. "The metadata problem is real. The date discrepancy is real. Torres is paying attention to both of those things. But it's not over." "No." "Wednesday." Gerald closed his briefcase. "But I'd rather be us right now than them." Landon stood, straightened his tie, looked across the now empty room at the Meridian table, where one of Pratt's assistants was gathering papers with efficient, expressionless speed. He picked up his jacket. "Wednesday, then," he said. He walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon. The sky was clearing after the weekend storm, pale blue at the edges, still gray at the center, the way Pittsburgh skies looked when the weather couldn't quite make up its mind. He stood on the steps and breathed in the cool air. He thought about his father's shop, the photograph on the wall, old Ray and his Buick. Emmy saying, "It's yours," with the total certainty of someone who had no reason to doubt it yet. He walked to his truck. He had 2 days. Well, when he got to Mrs. Paulson's to pick up Emmy that evening, she was at the kitchen table with a glass of warm milk and a look on her face like she'd been waiting. "Well?" she said. He sat across from her. "Wednesday," he said. She folded her hands on the table. "Then Wednesday," she said. He nodded. In the other room, he could hear Emmy talking to herself, working out some elaborate story with her toys. Something about a dragon and a castle and a princess who did not, Emmy had explained to him many times, need saving but would appreciate the company. He closed his eyes for just a moment. One more day, then one more. That was all he knew how to do. Wednesday came the way hard days always do, too fast and not fast enough at the same time. Landon was up before 5 again. He'd slept maybe 3 hours, maybe less, and the suit he'd hung carefully on the back of the door the night before looked slightly less crisp than it had on Monday, the way clothes do when they've absorbed the anxiety of a room. He made coffee, stood at the kitchen window with his mug and watched the street outside go from black to gray to the particular pale gold of early morning. A neighbor's dog was barking at something invisible. A garbage truck moved slowly down the block. Pittsburgh waking up the way it always did, without ceremony, without apology. His phone was on the counter. He hadn't touched it yet. He knew there were messages. Gerald had sent one late the night before that he'd read and then set down without responding to, because Gerald's message had said feeling cautiously optimistic, and Landon was too superstitious about good news to dwell on it overnight. He drove Emmy to Mrs. Paulson's. Emmy was wearing her good shoes without being asked, which she'd never done before, and when he looked at her in the rearview mirror, she looked back and said, very seriously, "I wore the lucky shoes." "Those are lucky shoes?" "The ones with the flowers. I decided." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Good call." Mrs. Paulson was at the door before he knocked, which meant she'd been watching for them. She gave Landon a look that communicated more than most full sentences could. He nodded once. She nodded back. Gerald was waiting on the courthouse steps again, this time with coffee. 2 cups, which Landon accepted with genuine relief. They walked in together and didn't talk much. There wasn't much left to say. They'd been over everything. Whatever was going to happen in the next few hours had already been set in motion. The courtroom felt different from Monday. Landon noticed it before he could articulate why. The Meridian team was present. Pratt and his 2 associates at their table, the same paralegal, the same company representative in the gallery. But something in their collective posture had changed. On Monday, they'd been arranged like people who expected to win. Today, they were arranged like people who were hoping to control how much they lost. Judge Torres entered at 9 sharp. She settled her glasses, opened the file, and looked up at the room with an expression that gave nothing away. "I've reviewed the contested exhibits and the supplemental documentation from both parties," she said. "Before we proceed, I have some questions for plaintiff's counsel." Pratt stood. "Of course, Your Honor." What followed was 45 minutes that Landon would replay in fragments for a long time afterward, not because he understood every word of it, but because he understood the shape of it. Torres walked Pratt through the photographic exhibits with a precision that was almost surgical. She'd had her clerk pull the metadata independently. The timestamps in the image files didn't match the timestamps listed in the exhibits, not by hours, by months. 3 of the photographs presented as evidence of lease violations occurring in October were, according to their own embedded data, taken the previous April. Pratt attempted several explanations. Torres listened to each one with the patience of someone who has already made up their mind but wants the record to reflect that they gave every argument its due. The explanations did not improve. A photograph showing heavy machinery staged in the garage forecourt, one of the primary pieces of evidence, had been taken at a different property entirely. Forensic analysis of the image background, which Torres had apparently commissioned independently through the court, had identified a utility line configuration that did not exist at Landon's garage address. Landon looked at Gerald. Gerald was looking at the judge with the expression of a man watching something he'd hoped for but hadn't fully allowed himself to believe. It continued. The lease modification document, the one predating Landon's signature, turned out to have been filed through an administrative process that Meridian's own legal team couldn't adequately explain. There was no record of Landon ever having agreed to the modification because, Torres noted dryly, there was no evidence the modification had been presented to him at all. By the time Pratt sat down the second time, his posture was no longer the posture of a man expecting to control anything. Torres took a 10-minute recess. Landon and Gerald sat at their table and didn't speak. Landon's hands were flat on the surface in front of him, very still, which was the only way he knew how to keep them from shaking. "Don't," Gerald said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't count it yet." "I'm not." "You're counting it." He wasn't, actually. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about the photograph on the wall of the garage. 1987, the paint fresh, the sign slightly crooked, that grin. He was thinking about how his father had worked 6 days a week for 20 years to build something that was worth fighting for. He was thinking that his father would have sat in this courtroom the same way he was sitting, hands flat, back straight, not showing anything. Torres returned. She settled behind the bench. The room was very quiet. The court finds that the photographic evidence submitted by the plaintiff has been materially altered and does not accurately represent conditions at the property in question, she said. Her voice was even, measured, the voice of someone for whom legal language was a native tongue. The lease modification document submitted as Exhibit 14 reflects a process that was neither completed nor properly disclosed to the defendant. The court further finds that the plaintiff's case as presented relies substantially on documentation that does not withstand scrutiny. She paused and looked at Pratt over her glasses. "Mr. Pratt, the court is dismissing this action in its entirety." The room didn't erupt. It was a courtroom. People in courtrooms had learned not to erupt. But Landon heard Gerald exhale beside him, a long, controlled breath that sounded like a man releasing something he'd been holding for 8 months. The Meridian representative in the gallery had gone very still. Pratt stood and said something about reserving the right to appeal. Torres noted it for the record and then said that the court was additionally ordering the plaintiff to cover the defendant's legal expenses, and that she was referring the matter to the State Attorney General's office for review of the plaintiff's evidentiary practices. That last part was the part that mattered beyond this one case, and Landon understood it even if he didn't fully understand the legal mechanics of what it would set in motion. Pratt sat down. Torres closed the file. Gerald turned to Landon and said, at a volume only Landon could hear, "You kept your garage." Landon looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up at the far wall of the courtroom. Then he said, "Yeah." His voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, we did." They shook hands at the table. Landon's grip was too tight. He felt it and couldn't help it. Gerald just held on. Outside the courthouse, in the pale November light, Landon sat on the steps for a few minutes while Gerald made phone calls and filed whatever needed filing. People moved past him. Attorneys, clerks, ordinary citizens navigating ordinary legal business. Nobody paid him any attention. He was just a man in a slightly rumpled suit sitting on courthouse steps, which was not unusual in this city or any other. He called Mrs. Paulson. She picked up on the second ring. He heard Emmy in the background asking something about breakfast. "It's done," he said. Silence for a moment, then quietly, "Good. Tell her I'll be there in an hour." "I will." A pause. "Landon?" "Yeah." "Your father would have—" She stopped herself, started again. "You did good." He nodded at the phone, which she couldn't see. "Thank you, Mrs. Paulson." He hung up. Sat for another minute. The sun was doing something through the clouds that wasn't quite warmth, but was the approximation of it, the suggestion of it. The kind of November light that doesn't actually heat anything, but at least proves the sun still exists. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and went to find Gerald so they could go through whatever came next. He had a garage to get back to. The Civic with the transmission problem had been waiting since Saturday. Some things didn't stop for landmark moments, and that was probably fine. It was more than fine. It was exactly what he needed. The drive back from the courthouse took 22 minutes through midday Pittsburgh traffic, and Landon spent most of it in a state that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite calm, but was somewhere in between. Like a pressure he'd forgotten was there, had been released so gradually, he was only now beginning to feel the absence of it. He turned the radio up. Let whatever was playing just be noise for a while. His hands were steady on the wheel. He stopped at a diner 3 blocks from Mrs. Paulson's house and ordered Emmy's favorite, chocolate chip pancakes, a side of bacon, orange juice, and asked them to pack it to go. While he waited, he sat at the counter and drank a cup of coffee that was stronger than his usual and ate a piece of toast standing at the pickup window and felt, for the first time in months, like a man who might actually be hungry. Emmy launched herself at him from Mrs. Paulson's front step the moment she saw the truck pull up. She was still in her good shoes with the flowers. She hit him at full velocity around the knees, and he bent down and picked her up and held her tight enough that she made a small sound of protest. "Too squeezy," she said. "Yeah." He didn't put her down. "Daddy!" She was laughing now, that high, clear laugh that he kept stored somewhere inside him for the days when everything else felt like too much. "You wore the lucky shoes," he said. "I told you." "You were absolutely right." He brought her inside and spread the pancakes out on Mrs. Paulson's kitchen table, and the 3 of them ate together because Mrs. Paulson had coffee already made and Emmy insisted she stay. Emmy ate half the pancakes and most of the bacon and told an extended story about something that had happened at school the previous Thursday that seemed to have no beginning and no end but a significant amount of middle. Mrs. Paulson listened with the patient attention of a woman who had been listening to children's stories her entire adult life and had never once suggested they get to the point. Landon sat at the table and let it all wash over him. It was a small kitchen. The windows needed cleaning. The coffee was a little weak, and Mrs. Paulson had put out napkins that had holly printed on them, probably left over from last Christmas. Emmy had a smear of syrup on her chin. The fluorescent light overhead had a barely audible flicker that had probably been there for years. It was the best breakfast he'd had in longer than he could remember. He didn't analyze that. He just let it be true. He spent the afternoon at the garage. Word traveled fast in small business communities, and by 3 o'clock he'd had calls from 2 other shop owners on the same stretch of Route 51, men he'd known peripherally for years, the kind of neighbors you nod at in the parking lot of the auto parts store but have never sat down with. Both of them had received letters from Meridian. Both of them had been quietly terrified and quietly not talking about it, the way people are when they're ashamed of being in trouble, even though the trouble isn't their fault. Landon told them what had happened. He told them to call Gerald Fitch on Penn Avenue. He read them Gerald's number off his phone and repeated it twice. One of the men, a heavy-set guy named Frank who ran a muffler shop 2 blocks down, went quiet for a moment and then said, "I didn't think we could actually fight back." "Neither did I," Landon said. "Until I did." He meant it. He hadn't been certain they could win until Torres started asking questions. He'd walked into that courtroom on Monday morning genuinely prepared to lose, genuinely prepared to figure out what you do when you lose something like that. And the fact that he'd prepared for it didn't mean he'd been okay with it. There was a difference between preparation and acceptance. He'd prepared. he hadn't accepted. He fixed the Civic's transmission that afternoon, worked on it for 4 hours, methodical and focused, the kind of focus that comes from doing something you know with your hands, while your mind processes something that happened. By 6 o'clock, he had the car running clean, sat in the driver's seat, and took it around the block twice, listened to the way it moved. Good. Right. The way it was supposed to sound. He locked up the garage at 6:30, stood in the forecourt for a moment in the early dark, looking at the building. The sign above the door, Hayes Auto Repair, black letters on a white background, had a small crack in the H from a rock that had kicked up during a storm 2 summers ago. He'd been meaning to fix it. He still hadn't. He looked at it now and decided the crack could stay. It had been there for the fight. It could stay for whatever came after. He drove home. 2 days later, he got a letter from Gerald confirming the formal dismissal and the order for Meridian to cover his legal expenses. Reading it, he felt the particular strange flatness that sometimes follows good news when you've been braced for bad news so long your nervous system doesn't quite know what to do with the opposite. He put the letter in a kitchen drawer. Not in a file, not in a folder, just in the drawer where he kept takeout menus and the spare key to Mrs. Paulson's house, and a birthday card Emmy had made him 2 years ago that he couldn't bring himself to throw out. He thought that was the right place for it. He went back to work. It was 2 weeks later when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't pick up. He was underneath a customer's pickup truck, his hands full of someone else's problem, and unknown numbers at this hour were usually either robocalls or wrong numbers. But something made him slide out and answer it, the same instinct that had made him pull over on the highway in the rain. "Is this Landon Hayes?" The voice was professional, controlled, familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. "Yeah," he said. "Who's this?" A brief pause. "Victoria Sterling. You drove me and my sister downtown in a storm about 3 weeks ago." He sat up on the creeper, wiped his hands on the rag. "Yeah, I remember. How did you get this number?" "Your garage has a listing." She said it without apology. "I called the shop number. Someone named Ray gave me this one." That would be old Ray, who treated the garage like a second home on account of the number of hours he spent waiting for work to be done on his Buick, and had apparently decided that answering the shop phone was within his informal duties. Landon made a mental note to have a conversation with Ray about that, and knew he would absolutely not have that conversation because Ray was 73 and had earned the right to answer whatever phones he liked. "Okay," Landon said. "What can I do for you?" Another pause, shorter this time. "I wanted to see how the hearing went." That was not what he'd expected her to say. He leaned against the side of the truck. Through the open garage door he could see the November street, overcast and gray, a couple walking past with a dog. "It went well," he said carefully. "Case got dismissed." "I know." When he didn't respond to that immediately, she continued, "I followed it. The court record is public. I saw the referral to the AG's office." He didn't know what to do with that information. He turned it over for a moment. "You followed the case." "Yes." "Why?" A pause that was more considered than the others. "Because what you described in the truck, what they were doing, I recognized it. The pattern. I've seen companies operate that way before." A slight shift in her tone. "I wanted to know if it worked out." He thought about that. Thought about a woman who ran a billion-dollar company tracking a courthouse outcome for a stranger she'd spent 40 minutes with in a pickup truck on a rainy highway. It didn't compute easily, but then most things that mattered didn't. "It worked out," he said. "Good." And she sounded like she meant it. Not in a performative way, not the way people sound when they're trying to seem interested. Just simply, directly meant. "I'm glad." "Thank you." He paused. I don't know. For caring, I guess. Don't give me too much credit. I had an assistant pull the court filing. It took about 4 minutes. That surprised a short laugh out of him, something about the way she deflated the sentiment before it could get too heavy. "Right. I also wanted to apologize," she said. "For what?" "For not asking your name until you were about to drive away. For not being more present in that conversation. Claire tells me I go on autopilot when I'm stressed and I'm not great company." "You were fine." I was distracted and transactional. He thought about it. She hadn't been warm exactly. That was true. But she'd also listened when he talked about Emmy, asked questions that were real questions, looked at him in a way that wasn't dismissive. I didn't mind, he said. I was tired. Probably not great company either. You were. She said it without hesitation, then moved on before he could react to it. Are you still at the same garage? I am. Got a lease extension. Meridian's pulling back from most of their Route 51 acquisitions while the AG reviews their files. That'll take time. Everything takes time. He looked around the garage. The Civic was gone, picked up by its grateful owner. There was a Jeep in Bay 2 now, and an Audi waiting outside. Work was work. But, yeah, I'm still here. Good, she said again. Then, Landon, I'd like to have coffee sometime, if you're open to it. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. He was fairly certain it wasn't that. Coffee. I know how that sounds. I'm aware that I am a stranger who called your garage and had your number extracted from a 70-something-year-old man. Ray's 73. Ray was very helpful. He also told me about his Buick. Landon closed his eyes briefly. I'm sorry about that. I found it charming. A beat. The coffee is not a business proposition. I'm not trying to invest in your garage or offer you anything. I'd like to talk again. Under circumstances that don't involve standing in the rain. He leaned his head back against the truck. He could think of 15 reasons why this was a complicated idea. He could also think of the way she'd said, I'm glad when he told her the case was dismissed, and the way she'd listened to him talk about Emmy on the highway, and the fact that she'd called old Ray's accidental phone receptionist service to track him down. He could think of those things too. Okay, he said. Okay? Coffee, yeah. He pushed off the truck. I'll warn you in advance. I can probably only do early morning or late evening. I keep long hours. So do I. And there was something in her voice that sounded slightly like relief, as if she'd expected a different answer. Early morning works. Saturday? Saturday works. She named a coffee shop in the Strip District that he'd passed 100 times but never gone into. The kind of place that looked expensive from the outside, which it probably was. He didn't say anything about that. He had the legal expenses reimbursement sitting in his account now, the first time in months that his bank balance hadn't made him feel physically ill to look at. He could afford a cup of coffee. Saturday, he said. 8 o'clock? 8 o'clock. He hung up. Stood in the middle of his garage holding the phone, aware of some low-level adjustment happening in his chest that he didn't entirely know what to do with. Ray was in the office area making himself a cup of the terrible instant coffee he insisted on bringing from home, even though Landon kept a perfectly functional coffee maker. He didn't look up when Landon came in, but there was something very deliberate about how he was not looking up. Ray. Did you give my cell number to a woman who called this morning? Ray stirred his terrible coffee. She sounded sensible. You can't just give out my... She said she knew you. He finally looked up. His expression was the expression of a man in his 70s who has run out of patience for formalities. Said it was personal, not business. I made a judgment call. Landon looked at him for a moment. How'd you know it was personal? Ray turned back to his coffee. Son, I've been around long enough to know how a person sounds when they're calling about a car and how they sound when they're calling about something else. He picked up his mug. She wasn't calling about a car. Landon left that alone. He went back to the Jeep in Bay 2, slid back under it, picked up his wrench. The radio was playing something. He'd given up tracking what station it was weeks ago and just left it on whatever came in. The garage smelled like oil and rubber and old coffee and the cold November air coming through the gap at the bottom of the roll door. It smelled like his place. Like his. He worked until 7, picked up Emmy, fed her the dinner Mrs. Paulson had already half prepared because Mrs. Paulson operated on the assumption that Landon's relationship with cooking was precarious and not entirely wrong about that. Emmy talked about school, a project they were doing about animals. She'd chosen octopuses because they had 8 arms, and she found that personally impressive. She demonstrated the 8 arms with enthusiastic approximation and knocked a glass of water off the table. They cleaned it up together, him with a dish towel and her with a wad of paper towels she'd pulled off the roll in a quantity that far exceeded what the situation required. She was earnest about it. She always was. He put her to bed at 8, read the dragon book. She fell asleep before the dragon did anything particularly interesting, the way she always did. He sat in the kitchen after, the quiet, particular kind of quiet that descends on a house with a sleeping child in it. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The kind with weight and warmth in it. He thought about Saturday. He thought about a woman who had stood in the rain and called him sensible. No, Ray's word, not hers. She'd said present. She'd said Claire told her she wasn't great company when she was stressed, which meant she'd told Claire about the truck ride, which meant she'd thought about it enough to mention it. He wasn't going to make too much of that. He was too old and too tired and too recently out of the worst year of his life to make too much of anything too soon. But he noted it, filed it somewhere. He went to bed at 10, slept better than he had in weeks. Saturday morning, he dropped Emmy at a friend's birthday party, a chaos of 6-year-olds and balloon animals that he left with some relief, and drove to the Strip District, parked 2 blocks from the coffee shop, walked. The November air was cold and clear, the kind of morning that felt like a specific announcement that winter was no longer negotiating, just arriving. The coffee shop was called Ellery's. Warm light through the windows, exposed brick inside, the smell of good coffee detectable from the sidewalk. He went in. It was 8:02. Victoria was already there. She was at a corner table, both hands wrapped around a mug, wearing something that was casual in the way that expensive things sometimes manage to look casual. Dark coat folded on the chair beside her, a simple sweater, her hair down instead of plastered against her face by rain. She looked different from the highway, more complete somehow, like seeing someone in their natural context instead of out of it. She saw him come in and raised a hand slightly. Not a wave, more like an acknowledgement. He ordered at the counter, plain black coffee, and carried it over to the table. They sat across from each other. There was a moment of adjustment, the kind that happens when 2 people who met in an unusual circumstance find themselves in an ordinary one and have to figure out what they actually are to each other without the drama of a storm to do the work for them. "Hi," he said. "Hi." She looked at him directly. She had that quality, directness, no preamble. "You look better than the last time I saw you. Last time you saw me, I had engine oil on my forehead. I meant before that. When you were driving, you looked like you were carrying something heavy." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "I was. And now?" He thought about it honestly instead of reflexively. "Lighter," he said. "Not light, but lighter." She nodded like that made complete sense to her, which he hadn't expected. "I know that feeling." She looked at her mug. "I've had a version of that year." "What kind of version?" She tilted her head slightly as if deciding how much to answer. "The kind where you're doing everything right by every metric that should matter, and something still feels fundamentally off." She said it without self-pity, just as a description. "The kind where you look up one day and realize you've been so focused on winning that you've forgotten what you're winning for." He looked at her. "What made you look up?" "Honestly?" A small wry smile. "Standing in the rain on the side of a highway while 30 cars drove past." He hadn't expected that either. He hadn't expected a lot of things from this conversation, and it had only been 4 minutes. "Claire's doing better, by the way," Victoria said, shifting slightly. "She was pretty shaken that night. She doesn't love helplessness. Neither of us do." "What happened to the car?" "Fuel pump. Your diagnosis was right, more or less." She paused. "The dealer was slightly horrified that I let a stranger look at a company vehicle. Tell him I went to school for it." "Did you?" 2 years of technical college, plus 20 years of watching my father." He drank some coffee. "He started the shop. I took it over when he died." Something shifted in her expression. Not pity. He was starting to read her face well enough to see the difference. More like recognition. "How long ago?" 4 years. "Was it what you wanted? Taking it over?" He'd been asked that before, usually in a way that implied the answer should be complicated, that he should have some grief about giving up some other path. The honest answer had always been simpler than people expected. It was the only thing that felt like it made sense. After he was gone, the garage it was still him, kind of. Taking care of it felt like the right thing to do. He paused. I know that sounds... No, she said. It doesn't. She was quiet for a moment. My father built his first company out of a studio apartment when I was 7. I used to sit on the floor and listen to him make phone calls. I didn't understand any of it. I just understood that it meant something to him. She looked at her coffee. He died when I was 22. Heart attack. He looked at her. I'm sorry. The company was in bad shape when he died. My mother wanted to sell. I told her to give me 3 years. She said it simply, without drama, the way you state something you've said enough times that the emotion has worn smooth. We're not selling. The Sterling Group. She looked at him. Gerald, my lawyer, mentioned it when we were figuring out who Meridian's parent investors were. He watched her face. You knew about Meridian? I suspected Meridian's practices. I'd heard things through the business community. Companies like that leave trails. She held his gaze. When you told me what was happening to you in the truck, I recognized the pattern. I'd seen it used before against smaller competitors. I knew what it looked like from the inside of an industry that sometimes operates that way. The question that formed was complicated, and he took a moment with it. Did you do anything about my case? She was quiet. Victoria. I didn't intervene in any legal proceedings, she said. I want to be clear about that. What Torres found, the metadata, the address mismatch, that came from her own clerk and an independent court examiner. Gerald found the date discrepancy. I didn't manufacture any of that. But, he said, she set her mug down. I made a phone call to someone I know who covers business litigation for the Tribune. I told them that the Meridian case might be worth looking at as part of a larger pattern of property acquisitions. I suggested they look at the court filings. She met his eyes. That's all I did. A reporter making phone calls to a courthouse is public record. The reporter found things worth writing about. He sat with that. He thought about the trial. The way Torres had seemed prepared, specific, precise in her questions. The way she'd commissioned her own forensic analysis. He thought about whether a story in the Tribune, even the suggestion of a story, would make a judge look more carefully. He thought about pressure and visibility and the way that public attention changes the calculus of people who prefer to operate quietly. You could have told me, he said. I didn't know if it would amount to anything. I didn't want to... She stopped. I didn't want to give you something to hope for that might not pan out. He thought that was true, and also perhaps not the complete truth, and he decided that was okay. People had their reasons and didn't always show all of them at once. He understood that from the inside. Okay, he said. Are you angry? No? He thought about it more carefully. I don't think so. I don't know yet. He drank his coffee. I think I'd have wanted to know, but I also know that I walked into that hearing ready to lose, and I didn't, and... He stopped. I don't know. I'm still working out how I feel about it. That's fair, she said. I'm not going to tell you it's nothing. What you did. What I did was make one phone call. Yeah, he looked at her. You made one phone call for a stranger who gave you a ride in the rain. She didn't look away. You gave me and my sister shelter when you had 14 reasons not to. I made a phone call. I'm not asking for a balance sheet. He nodded slowly. Outside the window, the strip district was doing its Saturday morning thing. Market vendors setting up, people walking dogs, the particular cheerful noise of a city neighborhood that hasn't gone quiet for the week yet. Pittsburgh, doing what it did. Thank you, he said. He said it simply, directly, without building it up. The way she'd said, I'm glad on the phone. She nodded once, then, tell me about the garage, what it actually is day to day. So he did. He talked about the shop the way he rarely got to talk about it. Not in terms of debt and lease disputes and what was at stake, but in terms of what it actually was. The regulars. Old Ray and the Buick, the Nguyen family, Mrs. Kowalski and the Oldsmobile. She would not let anyone else touch, and which required a specific sequence of coaxing to start on cold mornings that Landon had learned from his father and never written down because some knowledge was meant to be carried rather than documented. He talked about the satisfaction of a clean repair, something that comes in broken and goes out running the way it was supposed to. He talked about the wall with his father's photograph and the crooked sign and how he decided to leave the crack in the H. Victoria listened. Really listened, the way she'd listened in the truck. Not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually taking in what he was saying. She asked questions that were specific and interested, not conversational filler. She asked about the technical side, what it took to keep an independent shop solvent, what the margins looked like, what he was worried about on the business side now that the lawsuit was resolved. He answered honestly. The lawsuit was done, but the debt it had accumulated was not yet gone. He'd need to build the client base back up. He'd lost 2 regular accounts during the worst of it, customers who'd assumed the garage might close and had quietly transitioned elsewhere. The equipment in Bay 2 was aging. He had a list of things that needed doing, ranked by priority and by cost, and the list was longer than the money. "Have you thought about expansion?" she asked. He looked at her. "Not lately, no. I've been focused on staying open." "That's fair." She turned her mug in her hands. "I'm not pitching you anything. I'm asking what you actually want for it." He thought about that honestly, what he wanted. Not what was realistic, not what he'd been reduced to hoping for, what he actually wanted. "I want it to be the shop my father started. I want it to be good work at fair prices, and I want it to last." He paused. "And I want Emmy to be able to look at it when she's older and know that I didn't let it go." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That's enough," she said. "That's a complete answer." He looked at her. "Most people say I need to think bigger. Most people are wrong." She said it without apology. "Not about everything, but about that." He smiled. It surprised him slightly, the ease of it. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone more, I don't know. More like the people I picture when I picture someone who runs a company the size of yours." "And what do those people look like?" "Polished, like they're performing." He shrugged. "I don't know. I've never actually met one before." She looked at the window for a moment. "I perform plenty," she said. "You're just not seeing a performance right now." She looked back. "Neither are you, I think." He didn't have an answer for that. He drank his coffee. "Claire says I don't know how to turn it off," she said. "The performance. She says most of the time she can't tell which one is me." She said it without asking for sympathy. "It's probably more true than I want it to be. But not right now." She met his eyes. "Not right now." They sat there for a moment, the coffee shop moving around them. An espresso machine, a couple laughing at a table near the door, someone's dog visible through the window trotting past on a leash. "I should go," she said. She didn't sound like she particularly wanted to. "I have a call at 10:30. On Saturday." "On Saturday." A slight lift in her expression. "It's a character flaw." He stood when she stood. They were at the door of the coffee shop when she stopped. "I'd like to do this again," she said. "Coffee?" "Talking." She looked at him. "To someone who's not—" She stopped. Started again. "To someone who just talks to me." He understood what she meant, or thought he did. Someone who didn't know her title first, who hadn't arranged a relationship with her around what she could offer. Someone who'd met her cold and hungry on the side of a highway and given her a ride and asked for nothing. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that too." She nodded, put her coat on, opened the door onto the cold morning. "I'll call the garage," she said, and there was a faint note of dry humor in it now. "Ray can take a message." He laughed. She walked out. He watched her go for a moment, down the sidewalk, shoulders back, that particular posture of someone accustomed to moving through the world with intention, and then he followed, turning the other direction toward his truck. He drove to pick up Emmy from the birthday party. She climbed into the truck with a balloon tied to her wrist and powdered sugar on her face and what appeared to be a small temporary tattoo of a dinosaur on her left hand. "Good party?" he said. "There were too many balloons," she said, with the authority of someone who has a considered opinion on appropriate balloon quantities. "But the cake was good." He drove. The morning was bright and cold and the roads were clear. "Daddy," she said after a while. "Yeah, Bug." Is everything better now, with the garage? He kept his eyes on the road. Yeah, he said. Everything's better. She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she'd moved on, the way 6-year-olds did. Then, good, she said. Simple and final, the way she'd said it before. He reached over and squeezed her hand once. She let him, and then went back to examining the dinosaur tattoo, turning her hand over in the light to see it better. He drove them home. They did it again the following Saturday. Same coffee shop, same corner table, different order. Victoria had switched to tea, which she mentioned apologetically as if it were a minor character flaw, and Landon had arrived 4 minutes late because Emmy had decided that the dinosaur tattoo on her hand needed to be ceremonially renewed before he left, and the tattoo paper had been temporarily missing and the whole operation had taken longer than anticipated. He came in still slightly out of breath, and Victoria had looked up from her phone and said nothing about the time, just pushed the second chair out slightly with her foot in a gesture so casual it might have been accidental. It wasn't accidental. He was already beginning to understand the difference between what she did deliberately and what she did without thinking, and that particular gesture had been without thinking, which somehow made it mean more. They talked for 2 hours. He was late opening the garage. He didn't particularly care. They covered territory that felt both ordinary and not. Her work, his work, the mechanics of running things. She talked about the Sterling Group the way he talked about the shop. Not like a trophy, not like an abstraction, but like a living thing that required constant attention and occasionally bit you. She'd had a bad quarter. She said it plainly, without the kind of spin he imagined executives usually deployed around bad news. And when he asked what bad quarter meant at her scale, she told him the actual numbers, which were large enough that he had to consciously not react. She caught his expression anyway. I know, she said. It's ridiculous in context. I didn't say anything. You went very still. He exhaled. A bad quarter for you is more than my garage will gross in 20 years. Yes. She looked at him without flinching. And it's still a problem I have to solve, and it still keeps me up at night, and the scale doesn't make the weight of it any lighter. She paused. Though I recognize that's a hard thing to say to someone who spent the last year fighting to keep his lights on. You can say it, he said. I'm not keeping score. She looked at him a moment longer than necessary. No, she said. I don't think you are. The Saturday coffees became a thing. Not a scheduled thing. Not a thing either of them announced or named, just something that happened the way some habits form, through repetition without ceremony. By the 3rd week, Ray had stopped raising an eyebrow when Landon mentioned he'd be in late. By the 4th week, Emmy had been told about Victoria only in the most general terms. A friend from the city, someone Daddy talked to, and had accepted this with a 6-year-old's fundamental disinterest in the social lives of adults. December came in cold and immediate. Pittsburgh in December had a particular quality, not the gentle melancholy of autumn, but something more honest, more committed. The cold meant it. Ice on the early mornings, the garage roll door letting in drafts that no amount of weather stripping fully addressed, clients coming in with seasonal problems and seasonal moods. The Buick needed a new battery, which Ray accepted as a personal insult. The Nguyen family's minivan had a heating issue that took Landon 3 hours to diagnose and another 2 to fix, and Mr. Nguyen stood in the bay the whole time asking questions that Landon answered patiently because Mr. Nguyen was the kind of person who needed to understand something before he could trust it, and Landon respected that. The 2 accounts he'd lost during the lawsuit didn't come back. He'd halfway expected they might, once the news of the dismissal moved through the community. And some of it had, the kind of story that people liked, a small guy beating a big corporation. But businesses that made the practical decision to leave didn't always make the sentimental decision to return. He understood it. He replaced both accounts by December, one through a referral from Frank the muffler shop guy, one through a fleet maintenance contract with a local delivery company that had posted a notice at the auto parts store he frequented. The new contract was steady, predictable income. He signed it and felt the first genuine easing of the financial pressure that had been his constant background noise for a year. He called Gerald to tell him. Good, Gerald said. Now pay me. I thought you were billing Meridian. For the litigation, the ongoing retainer is still on you. Right. He did the math in his head. I'll have it to you by the 15th. I know you will. A pause. How are you otherwise? Better, Landon said. He was standing in the garage office, looking out the window at the forecourt. Ray was in his usual chair in the corner, reading a newspaper, apparently having decided that the newspaper was a worthy use of the time he spent waiting for his Buick. Actually better, not just saying it. Good, Gerald said again. You earned it. He hung up and looked at Ray. You know you could wait at home. Too quiet at home. Ray turned a page. You need someone to answer the phone. I have a phone system. Systems don't know when to tell someone to call back on the cell. There was no winning this, and they both knew it. Landon went back to Bay 2. He told Victoria about the contract at their next Saturday coffee. She listened and then said that steady fleet contracts were smart for exactly the reasons he'd already identified, and asked about the terms in enough detail that he realized she was evaluating them the same way she'd evaluate any contract. Not to critique him, but because she couldn't hear about a business arrangement without automatically assessing it. Am I being annoying? She said. No, you found a clause I didn't notice. It's not a bad clause, just worth knowing it's there. Can you tell when you're doing it? The analyzing? She thought about it. Sometimes. Not always. She wrapped her hands around her mug. Claire says I narrate the structural weaknesses of restaurants when we're trying to enjoy dinner. Do you? Probably. A slight pause. Our father did it too. We thought it was embarrassing when we were kids. Now I do it, and it's... She stopped. Strange to recognize yourself in someone who isn't there anymore. He understood that. He understood it in a specific bodily way. The way he sometimes caught himself diagnosing a car problem the same way his father had. With the same sequence of checks, the same order of elimination, a method absorbed so gradually over so many years that it didn't feel like learning, it just felt like knowing. Yeah, he said. It is strange. She looked at him. He used to hum while he worked, Landon said. My dad. Not any particular song, just this low kind of hum. And I caught myself doing it last week, under someone's Jeep, and I had no idea I was doing it until I stopped. Victoria didn't say anything. She just looked at him with the full weight of her attention, which he'd come to understand was the thing she did instead of offering easy comfort. She didn't fill space with words when the moment didn't need them. Most people did. She didn't. Sorry, he said after a moment. That's not... Don't apologize. I don't usually... Landon. Her voice was quiet but definite. Don't apologize for that. He stopped. Nodded once. They sat with it for a moment, just the ambient noise of the coffee shop around them, and it was not uncomfortable silence, which was something he'd noticed happening more and more. The silences between them had stopped being awkward and become something else, the kind you only got with people you didn't need to perform for. It was, he thought, one of the better things he'd experienced in a long while. Then she said, I want to show you something, and took out her phone, which was unusual because she generally didn't take out her phone when they were sitting together, a discipline he'd noticed and appreciated. She turned it to face him. It was a photograph, aerial, taken from some height, a sprawling industrial property on the edge of what looked like the eastern suburbs. What is this? He said. 17,000 square foot facility. Former manufacturing plant. The site was decommissioned 2 years ago. The owner is looking to sell or lease long-term. She watched his face. It's 12 minutes from your current location. He looked at the photograph, then at her. What are you showing me this for? Because I've been thinking about what you said, what you want the shop to be. She set the phone down. You said you want it to last. I think there's a version of this that lasts better with more space. He was quiet for a moment. Victoria, hear me out. She leaned forward slightly. You lost 2 accounts during the lawsuit because people thought you might close. That's not a reflection of your work. It's a reflection of vulnerability. The garage's footprint as it currently exists leaves you exposed in ways that size alone would address. She paused. This property could house a full-service operation, 12 bays, fleet maintenance, specialty work, staff, a business that isn't dependent on one person doing 14-hour days to hold it together. He looked at the photograph again, then back at her. And you're showing me this because Because I know the owner, she said, and because the terms I could negotiate on your behalf would be favorable in ways that wouldn't be available to you approaching it alone. She held his gaze. I'm not trying to take over your garage, Landon. I'm not looking to invest or acquire or control anything. I'm telling you that I have a relationship that could get you access to something you wouldn't otherwise have access to, and I'm asking if you want me to use it. He sat back in his chair. The coffee shop moved around them. He was aware of a familiar sensation, the wariness that had lived in him since the lawsuit, the reflex that came from having been maneuvered before. But this was different from Meridian. He could feel the difference, and he'd learned to trust the feeling. The difference was that she was asking. Why? He said. She looked at him steadily. Because you deserve to have it be easier. He sat with that for a moment. It was such a simple thing to say. Not because I see the business potential or because it's a good opportunity, both of which he knew she could have said and meant. She'd said it was because he deserved it. He didn't know how to hold that without being moved by it, and he didn't particularly want to be moved by it in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning, so he looked at the photograph. I'd want to understand the numbers, he said. Of course. And I'd want Gerald to look at any agreement before I signed anything. Obviously. And I'm not going to make a decision like this in a coffee shop on a Saturday. I'm not asking you to. He looked at her. Are you always this prepared? Something shifted in her expression. Not quite amusement, but in that territory. I thought about this conversation for 3 weeks. So yes, this time I was prepared. He almost smiled. You thought about it for 3 weeks. I thought about whether to bring it up at all for 2 of them. Then I thought about how to bring it up for 1. And this is the result. This is the result. He looked at the photograph one more time. 17,000 square feet. 12 bays. Something his father's shop had never been but might have become if things had gone differently, if the timing had been different. He thought about what it would mean to walk into a space like that, to build something new from the foundation that already existed, to hire people, the real staff, not just himself doing everything. He thought about Emmy asking whether he was worried. The answer to that question for months had been a constant, quiet yes. What would it feel like to get to a point where the answer was genuinely no? Let me think about it, he said. Take your time. Really, I need to actually think about it. I know. She picked up her tea. I'm not going anywhere. She said it lightly, practically, about the conversation, but it landed somewhere broader than that, and he thought she knew it had. He let it land. He didn't bring up the property with Emmy that night or the night after. He turned it over the way he turned over mechanical problems. First just sitting with it, letting the variables arrange themselves without forcing them, then gradually beginning to assess each piece. The financials were the first obstacle, and they were real. Even with favorable lease terms, a move of that scale required capital he didn't have. He'd need financing. He'd need enough stable contracts to demonstrate serviceability on a larger loan. He'd need, and this was the part that kept him up one night, he'd need to be willing to be bigger than his father had been. To grow beyond the thing his father had started, while keeping it somehow continuous with what it had been. He wasn't sure he knew how to do that yet. He talked to Gerald about it, not the specifics. He hadn't agreed to anything, just the concept. Gerald listened and then said, with characteristic flatness, Landon, the current space would be a problem for your growth within 2 years regardless of anything else. You've been patching this situation for a long time. If the opportunity is legitimate, the question isn't whether to move, but whether this specific move is right. You sound like you think I should do it. I sound like I think you should stop being afraid of the next thing because the last thing was hard. Gerald paused. Those are different. He thought about that for several days. The Saturday before Christmas, Victoria arrived at Ellery's carrying a flat package wrapped in brown paper, which she set on the table between them with a kind of deliberate casualness that fooled neither of them. What is this? He said. Something I found. It's small. I just thought you'd want it. He looked at her for a moment, then he peeled the paper back. It was a framed photograph, black and white, printed on heavy stock. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at, and then it hit him all at once. The storefront, the signage, the man standing in front with his arms crossed, and a grin that looked like it had been waiting for this specific moment his whole life. It was his father's garage. Opening day, 1987. Not a copy of the photograph on the garage wall, the same photograph, or close enough to be remarkable, but printed at a larger size, the image clearer, the detail sharper. How did you... He stopped. The Pittsburgh Business Archive has a collection of commercial photographs from the 80s. Local businesses, opening days, that kind of thing. I had someone look through it. She was watching him carefully. Your father submitted a photograph to the Chamber of Commerce when he opened. It's been in the archive for 30 years. He looked at the photograph. His father's face, young, younger than Landon was now. That grin, those crossed arms. The sign above the door perfectly straight in this version before whatever small calamity had knocked it off, true. Hayes Auto Repair, 1987. The paint so fresh you could almost smell it. He didn't say anything for a while. I thought it might be good, she said quietly, to have a cleaner version, for the shop. He set it carefully on the table, looked at it. Then he looked at Victoria, who was watching him with an expression that was open in a way he didn't usually see from her. Unguarded, a little uncertain, as if she wasn't entirely sure she'd done the right thing. Thank you, he said. The words were inadequate. He said them anyway. She nodded once, looked at her tea. It's not a big thing. It is, he said. It is a big thing. She didn't argue. They sat together a while longer than usual that morning. The coffee shop was playing something low and instrumental, something that sounded vaguely like Christmas without being aggressively about it. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning. Not the dramatic kind, just the kind that coats everything quietly while you're not paying attention. He asked her because he'd been wondering for weeks and hadn't found the right moment. What does your life actually look like day to day, when you're not in a meeting or on a call or in a car that breaks down? She tilted her head. Why do you ask? Because I've told you a lot about mine, and I realize I don't know much about yours, the actual texture of it. She thought about it. Early? I'm up early, usually before 6. I have a house in Shadyside. I've been there 3 years, but I still feel like a tenant somehow. Too many rooms I don't use. She paused. I run in the morning when I can. I'm not disciplined about it. Claire drags me sometimes. A slight pause. I eat dinner alone most nights. I tell myself that's fine, and mostly I believe it. Mostly, he said. Mostly. She met his eyes. I talk to Claire more than anyone. She's the one person who knew me before the company was what it is now, before I became the version of myself I am publicly. She finds me slightly unbearable, but she shows up anyway. That's what siblings do. Is it? I always thought that was just Claire. My brother and I... He stopped. He didn't talk about Danny often. Danny was a subject with sharp edges that he navigated around in conversation. My brother and I weren't close. By the time we might have been, he was gone. He looked at the table. Overdose. 7 years ago. The words sat in the air between them. He hadn't said them to many people. He didn't know why he'd said them now, except that she'd been honest with him. And it felt like the right currency to offer in return. I'm sorry, she said. Not with performance, just directly. It was a long time ago. He paused. It wasn't a long time ago. It's just what you say. You don't have to make it easier to hear. No, he said. I know. They were quiet. I don't tell people things like that, he said eventually. Usually. Neither do I. She said it simply. It's strange. I've talked to you more honestly in, 5 weeks now, than I've talked to most people I've known for years. She looked at the window. The snow was still falling, light and steady. I find that slightly alarming, and also... She stopped. Also? He said. She looked back at him. Also good. I think. He nodded. His chest was doing something he didn't name. Christmas came and went. He spent Christmas Eve making pancakes with Emmy at 6 in the morning because she'd woken up at 5:30, and he'd made the executive decision that sleep was no longer a realistic goal. He spent Christmas Day at Mrs. Paulson's because she'd invited them, and because the alternative was just the two of them in the house, and Emmy needed more than just him on a holiday, needed the particular warmth of someone's grandmother making too much food, and the small community of being somewhere that had history in it. Mrs. Paulson gave Emmy a sweater she'd knit herself. Emmy wore it immediately, over her pajamas, and kept it on for the rest of the day. She gave Landon a framed photograph of his mother, one he hadn't seen before, his mother young and laughing at something off camera, taken the year before Landon was born. He thanked her and had to look away for a moment. Mrs. Paulson patted his hand once and then went back to her kitchen, and that was all that needed to be said. Victoria texted him on Christmas afternoon. Just, "Merry Christmas." "Tell me Emmy's doing something chaotic." He photographed Emmy, who was at that moment attempting to teach Mrs. Paulson's elderly cat to shake hands. The cat was not cooperating. The photograph captured Emmy's extreme earnestness and the cat's profound indifference. He sent it. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then, "This is the best thing I've seen today, and I've been in a room with Claire for 6 hours." He smiled at his phone. He was aware that he was smiling at his phone at Christmas dinner at Mrs. Paulson's and that Mrs. Paulson had noticed. But Mrs. Paulson was the kind of woman who noticed everything and said nothing about most of it, and he was grateful for that. He texted back, "How's Claire? Wonderful. Loud. She made 7 different things for dinner and refuses to accept that no one can eat 7 things. Currently describing me as texting some guy, which she finds very exciting." He typed, "Accurate." A pause. Then, "Yes, accurate." He put his phone away and went back to Christmas dinner and the cat and Emmy's negotiations. January arrived with the weight of a month that knew it had to carry a lot. Landon made his decision about the property on a Tuesday morning in the first week of the year, standing in bay one of his current garage with a coffee that had gone cold while he stood there thinking. He made it not because everything was certain. Nothing was certain. That was the nature of any decision that mattered. But because Gerald's words had stuck with him, the thing about being afraid of the next thing because the last thing was hard. He'd been afraid for a long time. He was tired of planning his life around the fear. He called Victoria. "I want to look at the property," he said when she picked up. A pause. Then carefully, "Okay. I'm not saying yes. I'm saying I want to look at it. With Gerald. And I want to understand exactly what your involvement would look like. What you'd want from it. What the terms would be." "I don't want anything from it, Landon. That's the part I need you to actually believe." "I'm working on it," he said honestly. "That's why I want to look at it in person. I need to see the actual thing, not just a photograph." "Saturday?" "Saturday works." He met her there on a gray January morning, Gerald beside him carrying his briefcase, Victoria with the property contact, a man named Sutherland who managed the estate for an owner he described only as a regional investor with several holdings. The building was enormous in person, the kind of space that required a moment of adjustment when you walked in from outside. Concrete floors, high ceilings, large bay openings on the east side, an office structure built into the north end that was dated but functional. Landon walked through it slowly. Gerald walked beside Sutherland, asking questions about the lease structure, the environmental history of the property, the utility infrastructure. Victoria walked at a slight distance, which he noticed. She wasn't directing the experience, wasn't pointing things out or making suggestions. She'd brought him here and stepped back, and that choice said something he took seriously. He stood in the center of the main floor for a while, looked at the ceiling, the bay doors, the light coming through the clerestory windows along the south wall. 12 bays. A separate area that could become a proper reception and waiting space. Room for an alignment rack. A lift system that wasn't jury-rigged with aging equipment. Room for people, actual staff, more than the occasional part-time help he'd been limping along with. He thought about his father standing in the original garage on the first day, 1987. Arms crossed, that grin. He thought about Emmy in her flower shoes saying, "It's yours." He walked over to Victoria. She was standing near the east wall looking at her phone, giving him space. "What would the arrangement look like?" he said. Specifically. She put her phone away. "Sutherland will negotiate the base lease terms. I can call in a favor on the rate. Bring it to something viable for you, particularly in the first 2 years while you're building the client base. I'm not on the lease, My name isn't anywhere near the paperwork, and you have no obligation to me." She looked at him. "In exchange for nothing. That is the complete arrangement. People don't do things for nothing." "I know, but sometimes they do things because they want to, and the wanting doesn't require a transaction." She held his gaze. "I watched you nearly lose your garage because a company with unlimited resources decided it wanted your property. I watched you fight it without flinching. I'd like to help you build something bigger than they ever imagined you could." She paused. "That's the complete motivation. You can take it or leave it." He looked at her for a long moment. Gerald appeared at his shoulder. "The environmental documentation is clean. The lease structure has some standard commercial terms worth negotiating. Nothing unusual. The rate Sutherland quoted is—" He paused and glanced at Victoria. "Favorable." "How favorable?" Landon said. Gerald quoted the number. Landon was quiet for a moment. "That's below market." "Significantly," Gerald agreed. Victoria didn't say anything. He looked around the space one more time. The morning light was moving across the concrete floor as the cloud cover shifted outside. It was cold in here. The heating system would need assessment before spring, that was obvious. There were things that needed doing before the space was operational. It wasn't a clean handoff. It was going to be months of work and planning and cost, and there would be problems he couldn't anticipate from where he was standing. That was always true. That had always been true. From the first day he'd unlocked the garage on Route 51 after his father's funeral and stood there wondering if he knew what he was doing. He'd figured it out then. "I need 2 weeks," he said, "to run the numbers, to plan the transition. I'm not going to sign anything on the basis of this visit." "Of course," Victoria said, "and I need Gerald to review everything before it goes anywhere." "Obviously," Gerald said, without being asked. He looked at Victoria one last time. She was watching him with that direct, steady attention, the look she had when she was paying full attention and not managing her expression. Open. Uncertain in the way that meant she cared about the outcome. "Okay," he said. "Okay to which part?" "Okay, I'll run the numbers." A pause. "And okay, I believe you." Something shifted in her face, not a full smile. Something quieter than that. Something that happened mostly in her eyes. "Good," she said. He and Gerald walked out into the January morning. The air was sharp and still. Gerald looked at the building from the outside for a moment, then looked at Landon. "You're going to do it," Gerald said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to run the numbers." "You're going to do it," Gerald repeated. Landon looked at the building, the scale of it against the gray sky, something that could grow into something real, not just surviving, but actually building. The version of the shop that his father had never had the time or resources to reach. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." Gerald nodded. "I'll look at the lease documents this week." They walked to their respective cars. Landon sat in his truck for a moment before starting it. Through the windshield, he could see Victoria and Sutherland still talking on the steps of the building, her gesturing slightly as she made a point. She was in her element, negotiating, managing, the version of herself that ran things. And yet she'd called it a favor on his behalf and meant it. And he knew the difference between the version of her that made business moves and the version of her that had tracked down a photograph in a city archive and wrapped it in brown paper. He started the truck. He drove back to Route 51, walked into the garage. Ray was there. Of course Ray was there, with his newspaper and his terrible coffee, and he looked up over his glasses when Landon came in. "Well," Ray said, "I'm running the numbers." Ray turned a page. "You're going to do it." "That's what Gerald said." "Gerald's a smart man." Ray looked up again. "Your father would have done it too. He just never had the right opening." Landon looked at the wall. The new photograph of the garage, the cleaner, larger print, framed, that Victoria had given him, was hanging beside the old one now. Opening day 1987 in 2 versions side by side. His father's face, twice. The sign, straight in one, slightly off in the other. He'd put the new one up the week after Christmas. Hadn't said anything about it to anyone. Ray had noticed immediately and had also said nothing, which was the kind of acknowledgement that meant more than commentary would have. "Yeah," Landon said. He would have. He took off his jacket, hung it on the peg, and went to work. The Buick was due for an oil change. Ray watched him do it with the proprietary attention of a man whose vehicle is being handled by someone he trusts but verifies. "She's been a little rough on cold starts," Ray said. "I know. I'll look at the plugs." "I told you last month that I know you did, Ray." Ray settled back in his chair. "Just saying." Landon reached for his wrench. Outside, the January cold pressed against the walls of the garage, and the wind found the gap under the roll door and came through with its usual determination. The radio was playing something old. Merle Haggard, or someone who sounded like him. The overhead lights had the slight warmth of a space that had been heated by work and presence over many years, the accumulated warmth of a building that had been cared for. His phone buzzed on the workbench. He wiped his hands and looked. Victoria. A message that said, "How are you feeling about it?" He thought about how to answer that. He looked around the garage, at the walls and the photographs and the crack in the H on the sign, and Ray reading his newspaper in the corner and the Buick on the lift. He typed, "Like my father would have done it, so I'm going to. 3 dots. Then, that's the right reason." He put the phone down and went back to work. The afternoon moved the way good working afternoons did, with a rhythm, with the small, specific satisfactions of hands doing what they knew how to do. He found the issue with Ray's spark plugs. He fixed it. He took the Buick around the block and listened to the engine, and it was running the way a well-maintained 20-year-old engine could run. Not perfectly, but honestly, steadily, the way things that had been cared for ran. He pulled back into the forecourt, and Ray came out to meet him, despite the cold. "Better?" Ray said. "Better," Landon said. Ray looked at the car with something close to affection, then looked at the garage, then at Landon. "You've done good with this place," Ray said. He said it the way he said most things, without preamble, without decoration, just as a statement of observable fact. Landon looked at the building, the sign, the crack in the H. "Working on it," he said. Ray went back inside. Landon stood in the cold for a moment longer. The sky above Route 51 was deepening toward evening, that particular shade of winter blue that preceded the dark, clear, and cold and absolute. He went inside, closed the roll door against the cold, started the coffee maker because the instant stuff Ray brought was genuinely bad, and something had to be done about it. Got the paperwork he needed for the week organized on the desk, thought about the numbers he needed to run, thought about 17,000 square feet and 12 bays and what it might feel like to walk into a space like that and know it was his. His phone rang. It was Mrs. Paulson. Emmy wanted to talk to him. He picked up. Emmy's voice came through, bright, immediate, full of news about something that had happened at school involving a bird that had gotten into the cafeteria and the resulting chaos, which she described with the vivid specificity of an eyewitness to history. He sat on the edge of the desk and listened to his daughter tell him about the bird with his whole attention. Outside, the January dark came down over Pittsburgh, final and clean and cold. Inside, the garage was warm. He ran the numbers for 11 days. Not continuously. He wasn't the kind of person who could sit at a desk for hours at a stretch, and the garage didn't stop needing him just because he had something larger to think about. But at night, after Emmy was in bed and the house had settled into its particular quiet, he sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator and the lease documentation Gerald had annotated, and he worked through it the way he worked through a difficult repair. Methodically, without rushing, checking each figure twice before moving to the next. The numbers were not comfortable. They weren't disastrous either, which he'd half expected them to be. Gerald's annotation on the lease terms had confirmed what Sutherland quoted. The rate was genuinely favorable, below what the market would ordinarily bear, and the structure included a graduated increase over 5 years that was manageable if the business grew at even a conservative rate. The problem wasn't the lease. The problem was the gap between where he was and where he needed to be to make the move viable. Equipment, staffing, the working capital required to absorb the transition period before the new location was fully operational. He'd need a loan. A real one, not the kind of emergency bridge financing he'd been navigating for the past year, but a proper commercial loan with a proper term and a monthly payment he could build a plan around. He'd need collateral. He'd need a business plan that a lender would take seriously, which meant projections, which meant committing to numbers on paper that he couldn't guarantee. He didn't sleep well for most of those 11 days. He'd gotten used to that. On the 12th day, he called Gerald and gave him the summary. Gerald listened without interrupting, which was a good sign. Gerald interrupted when something was wrong and stayed quiet when something was working. "The loan is the right move," Gerald said when Landon finished. "You have the fleet contract as demonstrated income now. The case outcome and the AG referral actually help you. They're documented evidence that you fought for your business and won, which some lenders view favorably because it shows character under pressure. Or it shows that I've been in legal trouble. The framing matters. I know a commercial lender at Allegheny Community Bank who I've worked with before. He's sensible. I can make an introduction. I'd appreciate that. Get the business plan written before you meet him. Something real, not optimistic. Conservative projections that you can actually defend." Landon looked at the legal pad. "I'm not great at that kind of document. I know someone who can help with the structure." A pause. "Unless you already do." He thought about Victoria. "I'll figure it out," he said. He figured it out by calling Victoria because the alternative was paying for a business consultant he couldn't yet afford, and because she'd already offered more than he'd accepted, and he was trying to get better at letting people help him. He'd spent most of his adult life operating on the principle that needing help was a thing to minimize. That principle had served him in some ways and cost him in others, and he was old enough now to start revising it. He called her on a Thursday evening. She picked up after 2 rings. "I need help with a business plan document," he said. "Before I go to the bank. I know what the numbers are, but I'm not good at structuring them in a way that, I don't know, in a way that reads like a plan instead of just numbers." A pause. "When do you need it?" "Meeting with the lender is in 10 days. "Okay." He heard her moving, the sound of something being set down. "Send me what you have. The numbers, the projections, whatever you've been working with." "It's handwritten." A brief silence. "Photograph it and send it." He did. He stood at the kitchen table and photographed 3 pages of legal pad calculations and sent them to her phone, feeling slightly embarrassed about the handwriting, which was not good. She sent back a single message 20 minutes later. "This is solid. You were more conservative than you needed to be, which is actually good. I'll build the structure around it. Give me 2 days. She sent him the document on Saturday morning, 2 hours before their usual coffee. He read it on his phone sitting in his truck outside the coffee shop. It was 8 pages. Clean, clear, the kind of document that said everything the numbers needed to say without dressing them up beyond what they could support. She'd kept his conservative projections intact and built the narrative around them without exaggeration. The 5-year growth model was credible because it was grounded in actual demonstrated income rather than potential. He read it twice. Then he went inside. She was at the table. He sat down, put his phone between them, and said, "This is exactly right." She looked at the phone, then at him. "It's your numbers. I just gave them a structure." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Minimize what you did." She held his gaze for a moment. "Fair," she said. "It's good work. Thank you." She nodded, picked up her tea, and moved on in the way she did. Not dwelling, not accumulating gratitude like it was currency. He liked that about her. He'd come to like a lot of things about her that he hadn't initially noticed. He met with the lender, a careful, methodical man named Patterson, who wore reading glasses on a chain and asked every question twice in slightly different ways, as if checking whether the answers changed. They didn't. Landon sat across from him in a conference room at Allegheny Community Bank with the business plan Gerald had reviewed, and Victoria had structured and answered every question with the plainness of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to embellish. Patterson read through the plan, asked about the fleet contract, asked about the lawsuit. Gerald had prepared Landon for this, coached him on exactly how to frame it, and Landon told the truth in the order that made sense, which was the dispute, the fight, the outcome, the referral. Patterson looked at him over his reading glasses. "You spent 8 months fighting a company with significantly more resources than you." "Yes." "And you won." "Yes." "On the merits." "On the merits." Patterson made a note. didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "My father ran a machine shop for 30 years. I know what it takes to hold something like that together." He closed the folder. "I'll take this to the committee. I won't promise you anything, but I'll tell you that the plan is credible and the case is strong." Gerald had told him the same thing about the lawsuit. He drove back to the garage and didn't tell himself anything was certain. Patterson called 11 days later. The loan was approved. The terms were standard, not special, not discounted. The bank wasn't doing him any favors beyond the decision to extend the credit at all. He called Gerald to confirm the paperwork. He called Victoria and said simply, "It came through." She said, "Of course it did." "You sound unsurprised." "I'm not surprised. The plan was solid, and you make a good case in person. You're not trying to be something you're not." A pause. "Lenders can tell. Patterson told me his father ran a machine shop." That didn't hurt. He laughed. It was brief and genuine. She laughed too, and he noticed, as he sometimes did, that her laugh was slightly different from her speaking voice. Less controlled, more actual. He signed the lease on a Tuesday in February. Gerald was there. Sutherland was there. Victoria was not. He'd asked her if she wanted to be, and she'd said, without hesitation, "It's your signing. I'll celebrate with you after." He'd signed his name and looked at the space around him, the high ceilings and the concrete and the possibility of it, and he'd thought about his father and hadn't said anything about it because some things didn't need to be said out loud. After, he drove back to the Route 51 garage and sat in the office for a while. Ray was there. He told Ray. Ray looked at him for a long moment. "You're keeping the name," Ray said. It was not a question. "Hayes Auto Repair," Landon said. "Yeah." Ray nodded, picked up his newspaper. "Good," he said. The transition took 4 months. He'd known it would take time, but knowing that in the abstract and living it in practice were different things. He ran both locations, the old garage on Route 51 and the new facility, which he thought of as the new building because he couldn't bring himself to call it the expansion or the main location yet. Those terms felt like something someone else would say. He hired 2 mechanics in March, Marcus and a woman named Deb, who had 15 years of experience and a dry, immediate sense of humor that made the long days easier. He hired a part-time office manager in April, a woman in her 40s named Carol, who had worked for 3 different auto shops over the years and organized everything with a thoroughness that made Landon feel, for the first time, that the administrative side of the business wasn't going to eat him alive. It was not smooth. He would have been suspicious if it had been. Marcus was good, but had a habit of over-communicating problems to customers in ways that sent them spiraling unnecessarily and required Landon to recalibrate, diplomatically, more than once. Deb was technically excellent and socially difficult, which meant the Bay dynamic required management. Carol was organized to a degree that occasionally tipped into territorial, and there was a Tuesday in March when she and Deb had a disagreement about the parts ordering system that Landon spent 45 minutes mediating with no formal training in mediation whatsoever. He handled it the way he handled most things, by being direct without being aggressive, by listening to both sides fully before saying anything, and by coming to a solution that neither of them was entirely happy with, which, in his experience, was usually the sign of a fair outcome. After, he sat alone in the office at the end of the day and thought, "Dad, how did you do this?" The old garage he kept open through the transition, staffed by a rotating schedule that included himself more often than was probably wise. He wasn't ready to close it. The regulars were still there. Mrs. Kowalski's Oldsmobile, the Nguyen family's minivan, old Ray, and his Buick. He wasn't going to make them drive across town. He'd figure out the long-term plan for the Route 51 location when he had more bandwidth. He told Victoria about all of it, not in a reporting kind of way. He didn't send her updates because he felt he owed her a status report, but the Saturday coffees had continued through everything, through the signing and the hiring and the chaos, and she'd become the person he talked through things with the way most people talk to a partner or a best friend, completely, without editing himself for an audience. She was a good listener and a better analyst, and she knew when he needed analysis and when he needed someone to just confirm that what he was feeling was reasonable. In March, during a coffee that had stretched well past its usual endpoint, she'd said something that stuck with him. He'd been describing the Marcus situation, the over-communication with customers, and she'd said, You're managing people now, Landon. That's different from managing a garage. I know, he'd said. It's okay that it's harder than you expected. I didn't say it was harder than I expected. You didn't have to. She turned her mug in her hands. I've made exactly the same face you're making right now about a dozen different things over the past 4 years. The face that says, I understand the problem, but I don't particularly enjoy having it. He looked at her. I didn't know you could read my face that well. I've had some practice, she said, and he hadn't known what to do with that, so he'd looked at his coffee. He thought about that exchange later, more than once. The casual precision of it. The way she said, I've had some practice without any particular emphasis, like it was just a fact she was stating, and yet it wasn't just a fact. It was something she'd chosen to say. They were in territory that neither of them had formally acknowledged. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a shift in weather before the temperature actually changes, something in the air, a different quality of pressure. He didn't push at it. She didn't either. They were both, he suspected, people who'd been burned by moving too fast toward things that weren't ready, and the resulting caution was built in, deep enough to be structural rather than chosen. Emmy met her in April. Not planned. He wouldn't have planned it yet, not because he was hiding Victoria from his daughter, but because he understood that introduction was a significant thing, and he hadn't wanted to do it until he was certain of more than he currently was. But April happened the way things did when you stopped controlling every variable. It was a Saturday. He'd arranged for Emmy to be at the birthday party of a school friend, which ran from 10 to noon. The coffee was at 8. At 11:50, he got a call from the party host's mother saying Emmy was running a slight fever, and could he come early? He told Victoria, who was in the middle of saying something about a personnel issue at her company, and she said immediately, Go get her. Do you need me to? No, I've got it. He stood, threw down money for the check. I'm sorry, Don't apologize. Go. He went. He picked up Emmy, who was not significantly sick, warm, slightly glassy-eyed, the early stage of whatever was going around her class that week. She was also, because she was Emmy, talkative in the way that some children got when they were mildly unwell, not quieter but louder, more insistent, as if the discomfort was channeled directly into speech. He was buckled into the truck outside the party venue when his phone rang. Victoria. He answered. How is she? She's okay. Might be the thing going around school. Emmy said something in the background. She's fine. She's talking. I heard. A pause. Listen, I have something in my car. I picked it up this morning. It's nothing significant, just a book I saw at the market that I thought you'd mentioned Emmy liked. I was going to leave it at the garage, but since you're nearby, she gave him a cross street that was 3 blocks from where he was parked. He thought for exactly 2 seconds. We'll come to you, he said. He found her car on the street, the new Mercedes, the replacement for the one that had died on the highway. She got out when she saw his truck, a small wrapped package in one hand, her coat pulled tight against the April cold. He got out of the truck. Emmy, in the back seat, was immediately interested. Who's that? Emmy said. My friend Victoria. She has something for you. Emmy's eyes went to the wrapped package with the immediate focus of a child encountering a potential gift. Victoria came to the truck. She was looking at Emmy the way adults sometimes looked at children they didn't know well, carefully, not sure of the protocol, as if she understood children in theory but not quite in practice. Landon noticed this and found it unexpectedly endearing. Hi, Victoria said to Emmy. I'm Victoria. Emmy looked at her with the frank evaluation of a 6-year-old. My dad said you're his friend. I am. How long have you been friends? A few months. Victoria tilted her head. Almost 6 months, actually. Emmy considered this. That's a decent amount, she said, apparently satisfied. Is that for me? Victoria handed over the package. Emmy opened it without ceremony. She was not a careful unwrapper, and extracted a hardcover book about deep-sea animals. She looked at the cover. The cover had an anglerfish on it. It has an anglerfish, Emmy said. This appeared to be a significant positive. I heard you like ocean animals. I like land animals more, but anglerfish are an exception because they have a light on their head, which is very practical. She opened the book immediately, apparently no longer interested in the cold or the slight fever or anything else. Thank you. You're welcome. Victoria looked at Landon. He looked at her. She's exactly how I imagined her, Victoria said quietly. She's more, he said. It came out without him planning it. Something moved in Victoria's expression, brief and controlled and real. She looked back at Emmy, who was absorbed in the anglerfish page. I know, she said. He drove Emmy home. She read the ocean book in the back seat and narrated facts about anglerfish to him at intervals. When he got her settled on the couch with a blanket and the book, she looked up at him and said, She seems nice. She is. She knew about the anglerfish exception. She's perceptive, he said. Emmy accepted this and returned to the book. He went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and thought about that moment on the street. I know. 2 words, quiet and precise, the way she said things when she meant them completely. He thought about how she'd looked at Emmy and how Emmy had looked back at her, and how the exchange had been so straightforward and uncomplicated that it made the preceding months of his own internal complexity feel slightly absurd. He texted her. She said you seem nice. High praise from that particular critic. The response came quickly. The anglerfish apparently helped. It did. Good call. A pause. Then, how are you? He looked around the kitchen, at the slightly battered cabinets and the window he'd been meaning to recaulk since October, and the refrigerator with Emmy's drawings held up by magnets. A dragon, a castle that still looked catastrophic, a rendering of the garage that he'd been told was accurate but which he had some questions about. A home that was worn in and real and his. He typed, good. Actually good. The response was just, good. He put his phone away and went to check on Emmy. She'd fallen asleep with the ocean book open on her chest, the anglerfish page facing up. He lifted the book off gently, put a marker in it, and set it on the coffee table. Pulled the blanket up. She didn't stir. He sat in the chair across from the couch and watched her sleep for a minute. Just a minute. This was something he'd done since she was born. Watched her sleep when he had a moment, the way you check on something precious without knowing you're doing it. Then his phone buzzed. Not Victoria this time. Frank, from the muffler shop on Route 51. He'd been in contact with Frank intermittently since the lawsuit, the way you stayed in contact with a neighbor after a shared crisis. He picked up. I need to tell you something, Frank said. His voice was different from his usual, tighter, more deliberate. You know how the AG thing was still going through, the Meridian review? Landon moved into the kitchen, away from the sleeping Emmy. Yeah, Gerald's been following it. My cousin works in the county courthouse. Not in the review, just in the building. He said there's been a significant development. Some of their financial documentation from 3 other cases. Frank stopped, gathered himself. Apparently it's not just our strip. They were doing this in 4 counties. The same playbook, same falsified evidence. They just got sloppy enough in enough places that the pattern became visible. Landon sat down at the kitchen table. How significant? My cousin used the word criminal. Frank said it slowly. Not civil. Criminal referral. He didn't say anything for a moment. Landon. Yeah, I'm here. I thought you should know, before it's in the paper. Thank you, Frank. He paused. Did your cousin say when? Could be weeks. Could be sooner. These things... I know. These things move at their own pace. He thought of Gerald saying the same thing, approximately 100 times over the past year. Call me when you hear anything else. He hung up. Sat at the kitchen table in April afternoon light. He thought about the hearing, about Torres asking her questions and Pratt's posture changing, about what he'd said to Frank in November. They just won and they move on to the next person. He'd worried about that. He'd worried that the dismissal of his case was its own closed system, a win that didn't prevent the same thing happening to someone else somewhere else. He called Gerald. Gerald answered on the first ring, which meant Gerald had probably already heard. Frank called you, Gerald said. Frank called me. It's accurate. I've been in contact with the AG's office this week. A pause. Criminal referral is the right framing. It went to the DA's office yesterday. 3 other counties have joined the complaint. When does this become public? Probably within the week. The Tribune already has the story. They've been sitting on it waiting for the DA confirmation. He thought about that. About the reporter Victoria had called in November. About the call that had started what had apparently become a larger investigation than either of them had anticipated. He wondered if she'd known it would go this far, and then he thought that even if she'd hoped, she couldn't have known, and there was a difference. "What does this mean for the other business owners?" he said. "The ones on Route 51, the other counties." "It means Meridian's capacity to pursue anyone right now is essentially zero. Their legal team is occupied. Their parent investors are backing away publicly. You'll see that in the financial news once this breaks." Gerald paused. "It means Frank can stop being afraid of his own lease renewal. It means probably a dozen other people who were in the same position you were 6 months ago get to stay in their buildings." He sat with that for a moment. It was a complicated thing to absorb. The scope of it, the fact that something that had started as the worst year of his life had ended up as part of something larger. He hadn't set out to be part of something larger. He just refused to let them take his garage. "Gerald," he said. "Yeah. Thank you." "You did the work," Gerald said, the same thing he'd said on the courthouse steps. "So did you." He paused. "Send me your bill. The real one, not the discounted version." A longer pause. "The ordered expenses covered." "Send me the real bill, Gerald." Another pause. Then, "I'll send it." He hung up, looked at the kitchen. Then he picked up his phone and called Victoria. She answered on the third ring. He heard ambient noise behind her. She was somewhere with people, a restaurant or an event. "Hold on," she said. Then quieter, the background muting slightly. "What is it?" "The Meridian investigation. It went criminal. DA confirmation yesterday." Silence for a moment. "4 counties," he said. "A dozen business owners, maybe more." "I heard some of this," she said carefully. "Not the DA part. The Tribune is running the story this week. The same reporter." He paused. "Your reporter." "He's not my reporter." Victoria. "I made one phone call," she said. The same thing she'd said at Ellery's in November, but her voice was different now. Not defensive, just precise. "Everything after that was him. And the AG's office, and you." "And you," he said. She didn't argue this time. "This is going to be in the paper," he said. "Meridian, the scheme, the 4 counties. People are going to know." He paused. "When they write about the original case that triggered the review, that's me. My garage." "I know." "Are you okay with your name being connected to any of this? If anyone traces the phone call..." "I made a legal phone call to a reporter about matters of public concern," she said. "I'm not worried about that." A brief pause. "Are you asking because you're worried about me, or because you're warning me?" He thought about it. "Both," he said. He heard her exhale. Not quite a laugh, but close. "I'm fine, Landon. I've navigated worse attention than this." Then more quietly, "But thank you for asking." The story ran in the Tribune on Thursday. Landon read it at the kitchen table before Emmy was awake, with coffee, in the gray early morning. The reporter had written it cleanly and thoroughly. The scheme, the pattern, the false evidence, the 4 counties, the names of the other affected business owners, the AG referral, the DA confirmation. Landon's name appeared twice. The garage appeared once in a description of the original case that had triggered the larger review. There was no mention of Victoria Sterling or any phone call. The reporter had done his job and protected his sources with the professionalism of someone who understood what that meant. He read it twice. Then he went to wake Emmy up. She was already awake. She was sitting up in bed with the ocean book, examining a page about giant squid. "They can grow to 45 feet, she informed him when he came in. "That's very large," he said. "It's enormous." She looked up. "Are you okay, Daddy? You look like you're thinking hard." "I'm thinking," he agreed, "but it's the good kind." She accepted this with the particular trust of children who've learned to read their parents' moods. "Can we have the good cereal today?" "What's the good cereal?" "The one with the honey." "I thought we were out." "I found a box behind the regular cereal." He raised an eyebrow. "You were reorganizing the pantry?" "I was looking," she said with dignity. They had the good cereal. He made coffee. The morning moved in its ordinary way. The noise of a child eating breakfast and narrating her plans for the day, the sounds of the neighborhood, the early Pittsburgh light coming through the kitchen window. He texted Frank. "Did you see it?" Frank replied almost immediately. "Reading it right now. Landon, my God. Call me when you're done." Frank called 20 minutes later. He was emotional in the way that big men who didn't cry often got, controlled but strained around the edges like something was pressing from the inside. "It's over," Frank said. "For all of us. It's actually over." "Yeah." You never gave up. I want you to know that I've thought about that a lot. Most of us were just scared and quiet, and you—" "Frank," Landon stopped him. "You called me in November. You told me what you heard. That mattered. I didn't do anything." "You did enough." He paused. "Go call the other guys, the ones on your end of the street. Tell them to breathe." A moment of silence, then Frank laughed, raw and real and relieved. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, yeah." They hung up. Landon took Emmy to school, came back to the garage. The new building, the big one, 12 bays and the high ceilings, and Marcus and Deb and Carol already at their respective jobs. He walked through the space the way he'd been doing since they opened in March, a slow circuit of the floor before the day fully started, something that was part practical and part habitual and part something else he hadn't named. He stopped at the north wall where he'd hung the two photographs, both from opening day 1987, the original print from the Route 51 office and the cleaner version from the city archive that Victoria had found, side by side. His father's face twice, young and grinning, and the sign that was straight in one and slightly crooked in the other, and the fresh paint that you couldn't see in the photographs but that he could smell from memory. He stood there for a moment. Marcus walked past, coffee in hand, nodded at him. "Good morning," Landon said. "Morning, boss." Marcus disappeared into Bay 3. Boss. He still registered that word differently than he used to. He suspected that would pass eventually, that it would become ordinary. He wasn't in a hurry for it to. He went to his office, a proper office now, a room off the main floor with a desk and a window, and Carol's filing system occupying an entire wall, and sat down. Opened his email. There were 12 new messages, mostly parts vendors and a couple of fleet updates, and one from Gerald that said, simply, "You've earned a quiet week. Take one." Landon was fairly sure Gerald had never taken a quiet week in his life and was projecting, but he appreciated the sentiment. He typed a reply, fat chance. "But I'll take a quiet afternoon." He sat back. Through the window he could see the main floor. Deb under a vehicle. Marcus organizing something in Bay 3. Carol visible through the office window next to his managing whatever Carol managed, which appeared to be everything simultaneously. The building smelled like oil and rubber and the coffee someone always left on the burner too long. It was the smell of a working garage. It smelled like his. He thought about his father. He thought that his father would have walked in here and said something characteristically understated, something like, "Not bad, son," or "room to grow," and would have meant everything. He thought about Emmy saying, "It's yours," with the total authority of someone who hadn't yet learned to doubt what was right in front of her. He thought about Victoria on a highway in the rain, wet and guarded and real. He picked up his phone and called her. She answered immediately, as if she'd been expecting it. "I heard you read the article," she said. "How did you hear that?" "Claire sent it to me at 6:30 this morning with a row of exclamation points." He smiled. "What do you think?" "I think it's exactly what it needed to be," she said. "Complete, factual, clear." A pause. "I think you can breathe now, really breathe." "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." A brief silence, comfortable the way their silences had become. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "That night on the highway, when I pulled over, you looked at me like you were figuring out whether to trust me." "I was." "What made you decide to?" She was quiet for a moment. He didn't rush it. "You kept your hands visible," she said, "when you walked toward us. You knew two women alone at night might be scared of a stranger, and you thought about that before you thought about anything else. A pause. You made yourself less threatening on purpose, without being asked. Another pause. That's... She stopped. That's rare. He hadn't thought about that. He'd done it without thinking. I have a daughter, he said. I know. A brief silence. That's why. He looked at his window. Deb was doing something efficient and slightly aggressive with a wrench. Carol had appeared in the door of the adjacent office and was mouthing something at him he couldn't quite read, probably about a parts delivery. The ordinary machinery of a working day. Saturday? He said. Saturday, she said. He hung up. Looked at Carol, who was still mouthing. He stood and went to find out what she needed. The work was waiting. The work was always waiting. That was the thing about building something real. It didn't pause for your interior life, didn't hold its breath while you figured out what things meant. You had to do both at once, the building and the figuring, and you had to get comfortable with the fact that neither one was ever quite finished. He could live with that. He'd been living with it his whole life. He walked out onto the floor of his garage, his actual garage, 12 bays and 2 photographs on the north wall and a staff of people doing good work, and went back to the business of keeping it. The Tribune story ran on a Thursday, and by the following Monday, David Pratt had retained new counsel. Landon knew this because Gerald called him at 7:15 in the morning while he was making Emmy's lunch. Peanut butter, no jelly, cut diagonally because Emmy had strong opinions about sandwich geometry, and delivered the information with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 8 months being methodical and patient and was now watching that patience produce something visible. Pratt is cooperating, Gerald said. His attorney filed a preliminary cooperation agreement with the DA's office this morning. He's going to give them the internal documentation. Landon set down the knife. Everything? Everything. The falsified exhibit process, the chain of command. Who authorized what? Apparently there are emails. Gerald paused. There are always emails. What does this mean for the other owners, Frank and the others? It means Meridian's position in every pending or potential dispute becomes essentially indefensible. Their counsel will advise settlement across the board. Expect calls from their new attorneys in the next few weeks, offering to resolve anything outstanding. Another pause. Also, and this is significant, the parent investors have already begun distancing publicly. 2 board members resigned Friday. The company's development pipeline is frozen pending the investigation. Emmy appeared in the kitchen doorway in her school clothes, missing one shoe, holding the ocean book. Daddy, what does bioluminescent mean? It means they make their own light, he said. Then, into the phone. Sorry, go ahead. That's it, Gerald said. I just wanted you to hear it before you read it somewhere else. Thank you, Gerald. Go make your kids lunch. He hung up. Emmy was looking at him with the particular attention she deployed when she sensed something had shifted. Good news? She said. She'd gotten very good at reading him over the past year. He wasn't sure if that was something to be proud of or something to feel guilty about. Probably both. Good news, he confirmed. Where's your other shoe? I think the dog next door took it. We don't have a dog next door. I know, she said, and went back to looking for it. He finished making the sandwich, found the shoe under the couch, drove Emmy to school. Came back through the morning Pittsburgh streets, the May light soft and particular, the city doing the thing it did in late spring when the gray finally gave way and everything went briefly, almost aggressively green. He rolled the truck window down, listened to the city for a few minutes. Then he drove to the garage. The weeks after the Tribune story were busy in ways he hadn't entirely anticipated. The coverage brought attention, not just to Meridian's practices, but to his garage specifically, the small business that had started the chain of events. He got calls from other shop owners he'd never met, from 3 separate journalists, from a woman who ran a small business association in Allegheny County who wanted to know if he'd speak at their spring meeting. He said yes to the business association, no to most of the journalists, and returned every call from a fellow business owner personally, always with Gerald's number ready. Frank called to tell him that Meridian's new counsel had already reached out about resolving his lease situation. Frank's voice had that quality again, the strained around the edges relief of a man putting something heavy down. They're offering to waive the disputed terms entirely, Frank said. Just gone. Like it never happened. Take it, Landon said, but have a lawyer read it first. Gerald? Gerald. He heard Frank exhale. I keep thinking I should be angrier about how long it went on, about how scared we all were. You can be angry, Landon said. That's fair. But angry and relieved aren't mutually exclusive. Is that how you feel? He thought about it honestly. He was standing in the main floor of the new building, the May morning coming through the clerestory windows in long parallels across the concrete. Marcus was in Bay 4. Deb was outside doing a test drive. Carol was on the phone in her office, speaking with the focused urgency of a woman who treated every phone call as a logistical operation. Mostly, I feel like I want to work, he said. The anger kind of burned itself up during the fight. Now, there's just this. He gestured at the space, even though Frank couldn't see it. The thing I was fighting for. There was a brief silence. You're a different kind of person than me, Frank said, not as a criticism, just as an observation. We got to the same place, Landon said. That's what matters. He gave a speech at the Allegheny County Small Business Association in May, which was the first time he'd ever given a speech to an audience in his life. He stood at a podium in a conference room at a hotel downtown and looked at 60 faces. Shop owners, contractors, small manufacturers, the owners of restaurants and dry cleaners and hardware stores, people who ran things with their hands and their names attached. And he talked about what the past year had actually been like. Not the version that made him sound like a hero. The real version, the fear, the sleepless nights, the morning he'd walked into a courthouse expecting to lose, the moment he'd almost accepted a settlement just to make the pressure stop. He said that last part clearly because he thought it was the most important part. That there had been a moment when giving up had been the rational choice, the path of least resistance, and he'd nearly taken it. What had stopped him wasn't some extraordinary courage that other people didn't have. It was Gerald saying they're overreaching, and Emmy saying it's yours, and Mrs. Paulson sitting across from him at a kitchen table and not asking him to be anything other than what he was. He said, "Nobody does this alone. I don't care how it looks from the outside. You find the people who believe the thing is worth fighting for, and you let them help you, and you don't mistake that for weakness." The room was quiet in the way rooms get when people are listening with more than just their ears. He said, "I kept my garage. A lot of people are going to keep their businesses because of what came out of this. That's not a small thing, but I want to be honest with you. I didn't do it because I'm brave. I did it because I didn't know how to do anything else." Afterward, a woman came up to him. She was in her 60s, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of managing something with her own hands. She owned a printing shop in the North Side. She'd been fighting a different version of the same problem, a different corporation, a different manufactured dispute, the same pressure campaign. "I was about to settle," she said, "next week. I was going to sign the papers." She looked at him. "I'm not going to settle." He didn't say you'll be fine, or it'll work out, because he didn't know that, and he wasn't in the business of making promises that weren't his to make. He said, "Call Gerald Fitch on Penn Avenue. Tell him I sent you." She wrote it down. He drove home that evening thinking about his father, about whether his father had ever stood in a room and said something that mattered to people he'd never met. Probably not. His father had been a quiet man, contained, most of his wisdom dispensed in small amounts to a small audience. But he'd built something that lasted, and lasting things rippled. That was what Landon was only now understanding, at 32, after the worst year of his life and the strange, unplanned months that followed it. The things you build with integrity outlast the moment you build them in. They go places you don't see. Victoria had texted him during the speech. She hadn't known about it until Claire had seen a mention on a business association newsletter. The text said, "Claire just sent me something. You gave a speech today?" He'd read it in the parking lot of the hotel. Typed back, "Apparently. How was it?" He thought about the woman from the printing shop, about her writing Gerald's number down. "I think it was okay," he typed. "Someone's going to call Gerald." A pause. Then, "That's what okay looks like for you." He'd smiled at his phone again. He was doing that more. June arrived without announcement. The new building had settled into its rhythm. The chaos of the first months giving way to something more functional, more itself. Carol had reorganized the parts system twice and was threatening a third reorganization, which Landon had quietly asked her to hold off on until after the summer fleet contracts renewed. Marcus had gotten better with clients. Landon had brought him along on one customer conversation explicitly to demonstrate how to frame a problem without causing panic, and Marcus had watched and absorbed and was notably different after. Deb remained technically excellent and socially challenging, but she and Carol had reached some kind of accord that Landon hadn't brokered and didn't entirely understand, which he considered the best possible outcome. He'd hired a third mechanic in June, a young man named Torres, no relation to the judge, who was fresh out of technical college and asked questions constantly in the way of someone who knew they didn't know everything yet and wasn't embarrassed by it. Landon liked him immediately for exactly that reason. He kept the Route 51 garage open with rotating coverage, himself and Marcus alternating. He wasn't ready to close it. He didn't think he ever would be, fully. It was the original thing. It had the crack in the H and the photograph on the wall and the particular smell of 35 years of repair work absorbed into the walls. Old Ray came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays with his Buick and his terrible instant coffee and his newspaper, and the Nguyen family came in for their minivan, and Mrs. Kowalski brought the Oldsmobile in May for its seasonal check with the kind of ceremony she accorded all serious events. He did that work himself, always. Some things shouldn't be delegated. The Saturday coffees had changed by June, not in their existence, but in their character. They were still at Ellery's, still the corner table, but they'd stopped having a defined endpoint. They ran to noon sometimes, occasionally past it. They'd started walking afterward through the Strip District or along the river, the kind of walk that has no destination and doesn't need one. They talked about everything and nothing in the particular way of people who've stopped needing to manage what they reveal. He'd learned things about her that she didn't advertise, that she kept a notebook, handwritten, not digital, of problems she was working through, and that the notebook was usually illegible to anyone but her. That she couldn't stand silence on airplanes and had an extensive podcast backlog she was perpetually behind on. That she'd almost left the company 3 years ago when her mother's health was declining, and that choosing to stay had cost her something she hadn't entirely reconciled. That she had a talent for sitting with difficult things without needing to resolve them prematurely, a quality he recognized and respected because he had some version of the same. She'd learned things about him. That he talked to his father's photograph sometimes, just briefly, usually when something significant happened, not a conversation exactly, but an acknowledgement. That he was a better cook than he let on, but had gotten so accustomed to fast, simple meals during the hardest years that reverting to actual cooking felt like a luxury he had to give himself permission for. That he was afraid of something more than failure. He was afraid of the moment after the fear lifted, the open space where the next thing lived, because the next thing was unknown in ways that fighting was not. She'd said, when he told her that, "I know exactly what you mean." "Do you?" "I've been waiting for a crisis I could solve for 4 years. Because solving a crisis is a specific task with a specific endpoint, and the thing that comes after the crisis." She'd looked at the river. They were walking along the Allegheny, a Sunday this time, the summer light on the water doing the particular thing it did in the hours before evening. The thing that comes after is just living. And living requires you to choose it consciously, every day, without the crisis forcing the choice. He'd walked beside her for a moment without answering. "You're describing me," he said eventually. "I'm describing both of us," she said. It was a Sunday in late June, not a Saturday. They'd started seeing each other on Sundays too without formally deciding to, when Emmy met Victoria properly. Not the brief street encounter in April, but actually, fully, with time and food and the particular chaos of spending an afternoon with a 6-year-old who had no social agenda and therefore asked every question she thought of without filtering. It was Landon's idea. He'd thought about it for weeks, the way he thought about things that mattered. From multiple angles, testing the edges, making sure he wasn't moving out of impatience. When he decided it was right, he called Victoria and said, "Emmy wants to know if you want to come for lunch on Sunday. I want that too. If you're ready." A pause. "I'm ready." "It might be, Landon, I'm ready." He made lunch. Real lunch. He'd given himself permission for actual cooking, and he made a proper pasta, something his mother had taught him that he hadn't made in years. The kind that took 2 hours and made the kitchen smell like a home. Emmy had stationed herself on the kitchen stool and narrated his cooking process with the authority of a culinary commentator who had never cooked anything. Victoria arrived at noon carrying a box of pastries from a place in Shadyside, which Emmy inspected with the seriousness of an assessor and pronounced acceptable. She sat at the kitchen table and Emmy, who had never been shy in her life, immediately began showing her things. The dragon book, the ocean book, a drawing she'd done at school of what she said was the garage, but which Landon privately thought looked more like a large gray rectangle, and a rock she'd found at the park that she believed was significant for reasons she was still formulating. Victoria looked at each thing with genuine attention. She didn't perform interest. Landon had seen her perform interest in professional settings and knew what it looked like. This was different. She held the rock and turned it over and asked Emmy where she'd found it. And Emmy told her, and then Victoria said something about the way certain rocks showed pressure changes over time from the way their layers compressed, which she'd apparently retained from a geology class she'd taken in college and never expected to use, and Emmy's eyes went wide. "The rock is old?" Emmy said. "Very old, probably." "How old?" "Millions of years, maybe." Emmy looked at the rock with entirely new eyes. Then she looked at Landon. "Daddy, why didn't you tell me rocks were old?" "I didn't know you'd asked." Emmy looked back at Victoria. "You know a lot of things." "Some things," Victoria said. "You know things I don't." "Like what?" "Anglerfish." Emmy considered this. "That's true," she said magnanimously, and went to put the rock in a place of honor on her windowsill. They ate lunch at this kitchen table, the three of them, with the windows open and the June afternoon coming in with the smell of the neighborhood, cut grass and someone's barbecue, and the distant sound of kids on the street. Emmy ate her pasta and told an extended story about something that had happened at school involving a failed science experiment and a very surprised teacher. Victoria listened and asked follow-up questions and laughed at the right places, not the polite laugh she deployed at business dinners, but the real one, the one that was slightly less controlled. After, Emmy went to her room to draw, which she did every afternoon as a matter of personal policy. The kitchen was quiet. Landon was washing the pasta pot. Victoria was at the table with her coffee, which she'd switched back to from tea sometime in the spring without explanation. He could feel her presence behind him, the way you feel the presence of people you've stopped needing to watch. "She's extraordinary," Victoria said. "She's 6. That's what makes it extraordinary." A pause. "She doesn't perform, she just is. She says exactly what she thinks and expects the world to accept that." "She gets it from her dad," he said, without thinking. Silence. Then, "Yeah," Victoria said. "She does." He put the pot in the drying rack, turned around. She was looking at him the way she sometimes did. That full, unmanaged attention, the look she had when she'd stopped performing for the room. "I want to say something," she said. He leaned back against the counter. "Okay." "I've been thinking about how to say it for a while, and I don't think there's a version that doesn't sound insufficient. So I'm just going to say it plainly. That's usually the right move." She looked at her coffee, then at him. "I was not doing well before that storm. Not in ways anyone could see, but the company was fine, Claire was fine, everything that was supposed to matter was intact. But I was—" She paused. "I was going through the motions of a life I'd built without fully choosing it, successful and hollow, and getting better at not noticing the hollow part." He didn't say anything. "And then I stood on a highway in the rain and a stranger stopped, and everything about how he handled that—" She stopped. Started again. "Everything about how you handled that was so unperformative. You didn't know who I was. You didn't want anything. You were exhausted and you stopped anyway, and you were just honest the whole time. About being tired, about Emmy, about the lawsuit." She met his eyes. "I've been surrounded by people my entire adult life, and I cannot tell you the last time someone was just honest with me without an agenda attached." The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm not saying you saved me," she said. "I'm not that. I'm not the version of this where someone rescues someone else and everything is simple. I did my own work, but you. She looked at him steadily. You reminded me what to look for. In people. In myself. He was quiet for a moment. Victoria, I'm not finished. He waited. I'm not good at this, she said. The personal part. Claire would tell you, I'm careful to the point of being closed, and I analyze things I should just feel, and I pick the wrong moments to be professional and the wrong moments to be vulnerable, and I still have not figured out how to leave work at work. She said it all clearly, without self-pity, just as an inventory. I'm telling you this because I think you should know what you're dealing with if... She stopped. If this is what I think it is. He pushed off the counter and came to the table, sat down across from her. I know what it is, he said. She looked at him. I've known for a while, he said. I've been waiting for the right time, and then I realized that I was doing the thing I do, which is managing everything carefully instead of just... He stopped, exhaled. You're not the only one who picks the wrong moments. Her expression shifted. The composed version of her face cracked slightly, the way it did when something moved her that she hadn't prepared for. I'm also not easy, he said. I work too much. I'm still learning how to let anyone help me with anything. I have a daughter who will ask you about your opinions on deep-sea animals within 5 minutes of meeting you and will absolutely tell you if she disagrees. He looked at her. And He paused. I'm done waiting for the right time. I don't think there is one. I think there's just time and what you do with it. She was quiet. Her eyes were very bright. So, he said, Victoria Sterling, you want to do this? She looked at him for a long moment, the composed face, the composed woman, and then she laughed, the real one, the uncontrolled one, brief and genuine. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him and turned her palm up and held on, and they sat like that at his kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in June, with the windows open and Emmy in the next room narrating something to herself in the ongoing story she was always writing. Emmy appeared in the doorway. She looked at them, at their hands on the table. Her expression was thoughtful and entirely unreadable for a moment. She had, when she chose to deploy it, a poker face that Landon found both admirable and slightly alarming. Then she said, Are you guys holding hands? Yes, Landon said. Emmy absorbed this. Okay, she said. Then, can we have the pastries now? Victoria made a sound that was the closest thing to undone Landon had ever heard from her. Yes, she said, and her voice was slightly rough. Absolutely. Emmy disappeared to get plates. Victoria looked at Landon. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was too ordinary to be dramatic and too significant to be ignored. Just the recognition, simple and solid, of two people who had arrived at the same place by routes they couldn't have predicted. They had the pastries. Emmy approved of them fully. The summer moved in the way summers do when you're no longer bracing for the next bad thing, faster than expected, fuller than you'd anticipated. July brought heat and the particular chaos of a garage in peak season. Vehicles that had been neglected through the winter, now presenting their accumulated grievances. Torres proved himself on a difficult transmission job that Marcus had marked as requiring specialist attention, and Landon felt the specific satisfaction of having hired someone right. Deb asked for a raise in July. He gave her one. It was the right amount less than she'd asked for, and the right amount more than he'd originally thought he could offer, and she accepted it without further negotiation, which he took as a sign that the number was fair. He thought about his father a lot that summer, not with the grief that had defined the early years. The grief was still there, but it had settled into something livable, the way grief does when you stop fighting it and let it become part of the landscape. He thought about his father the way you think about someone who shaped you, with recognition, with gratitude, and occasionally with something like conversation. He'd catch himself explaining a decision to his father in his head, not asking permission, just accounting. Here's what I did. Here's why. Here's what I think you would have said. He thought his father would have liked the new building, would have walked through it with his arms crossed and said something like, You'll need to sort out the drainage in Bay 7 and been right. would have given Torres exactly one piece of advice that Torres would have remembered forever, would have nodded at the two photographs on the north wall without saying anything, and the not saying anything would have said everything. Victoria's company had a complicated summer. The bad quarter she'd mentioned in December had been the leading edge of a larger problem with the division she'd been managing at a distance, and by July she was deep in the kind of organizational restructuring that consumed her attention and her patience in equal measure. He saw her on Sundays when he could. He didn't push when she was buried. She called him late some evenings, after Emmy was in bed, and talked through what she was dealing with the way she'd been learning to talk through things. Not performing, not managing, just saying what was actually happening. Once, at 10:30 on a Wednesday, she called him and started talking, and then stopped herself mid-sentence and said, "I'm just venting. Tell me to stop." "No, I'm not going to tell you to stop," he said. "You were probably asleep." "I was reading." "What?" He looked at the book in his hand. It was the ocean book. He'd picked it up from Emmy's room after putting her down and had been reading about bioluminescence, which he'd found more interesting than anticipated. "Something about deep-sea animals," he said. A pause. Then a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a release of tension, and then she said, "Landon, yeah. Thank you." "For what?" "For being—" She stopped. "For just being what you are." He didn't have a sophisticated response to that. He said, "Same," and meant it completely, and she knew he meant it. The Meridian case resolved in September. Not just his case, the whole thing. The DA filed formal charges against 4 Meridian executives, including the man whose face Landon had never seen, but whose signature had been on the original legal action. The parent investors settled with the affected business owners across all 4 counties, a process mediated through the court that produced individual compensation packages Gerald described as genuinely fair, which from Gerald was high praise. The company's development operations were suspended pending the criminal proceedings. Gerald sent Landon a 2-sentence email. "It's over, completely." He read it in the office at the garage on a Tuesday morning with his second coffee of the day, with Marcus and Deb and Torres working in the bays outside his window. He read it twice. Then he got up and walked to the north wall and looked at the 2 photographs for a minute. "We're good, Dad," he said quietly to the younger version of his father's face. He went back to work. He told Emmy that night. She was at the kitchen table doing homework. She had homework now, real homework, 2nd grade having arrived with expectations. She was writing something in large, careful letters, her tongue between her teeth in concentration. "The bad business thing," he said. "It's done. Finished." She looked up. "All the way done." "All the way done." She nodded with the satisfaction of something resolved. "Good." Then she looked back at her homework, then back at him. "Daddy?" "Yeah." "Were you scared the whole time?" He sat down across from her. "Most of it, yeah." "But you kept going." "Yeah." She thought about this with the focus she brought to things she was taking seriously. Why? He thought about the real answer, not the simple version, but the actual one, the one that had taken him a year and some change to understand. "Because I didn't want to show you that when things get hard, you walk away from them." He looked at her. "I wanted to show you what it looks like to stay." She looked at him for a long moment. 7 now. She'd had a birthday in August, dragon cake, Mrs. Paulson and Victoria and Claire and Frank and his wife all crowded into the backyard, the general noisy warmth of people who'd accumulated around a life without being formally invited. 7. And already she had the particular old soul quality of children who've paid attention to the adults in their lives. "I think you did," she said. He reached over and ruffled her hair, which she protested. She went back to her homework. He made dinner, real dinner, the pasta again. He'd been making it more often since June, the kind of cooking that required actual time and attention. Emmy ate it and declared it better than last time, which he accepted. They cleaned up together, her with the dish towel and the characteristic enthusiasm for using 15 times more towel than necessary. Victoria came over after, as she did on Tuesdays now. She let herself in with the key he'd given her in August. Not a ceremony, just a practical thing he'd said one afternoon, "Here, so you don't have to wait on the step," and came into the kitchen where Emmy was finishing the last of her homework and Landon was putting the dishes away. She had her coat still on, and her bag over her shoulder, and the look of someone coming out of a long day. And Emmy looked up and said, "Hi, Victoria," without looking up from her worksheet, the casual comfort of someone whose presence was just part of the landscape now. "Hey," Victoria said. She put her bag down, looked at Landon. He looked back at her. "Long day?" he said. "Long day." She came to the counter. "It's done, though. The restructuring. The division lead agreed to the terms." She exhaled. "It's done." "Good day, then." "Yeah." She looked at Emmy, at him, at the kitchen that smelled like pasta and the faint traces of a real evening in it. "Good day." He poured her coffee. She took it and leaned against the counter beside him, and they stood together the way people stand when they've gotten comfortable enough not to need anything from the position except proximity. Emmy finished her worksheet, looked it over with the expression of a person who knows she's probably missed something but can't identify what. Then she looked up at the two of them. "Did you know," she said, addressing them both with the authority of someone delivering important information, "that the Dumbo octopus can live deeper than any other octopus? Like, way deeper, where there's no light at all." I did not know that," Victoria said. "How do they see?" Landon said. Emmy looked at him with mild disappointment. "They don't see, Daddy. They feel. They have really good sensors." She gathered her worksheet. "That's how they know where they're going." She took her homework to her room. Landon and Victoria stood in the kitchen. "That child," Victoria said. "I know," he said. She turned her coffee in her hands. He looked at the kitchen window. Dark outside now, the September evening pressing against the glass, the warm interior of the house holding its own. He thought about Emmy's answer. They don't see. They feel. That's how they know where they're going. He thought about a highway in a storm, a luxury car on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking in the rain. The 4 seconds he'd sat in his truck deciding whether to stop, and the thing that had made him get out. Not calculation, not expectation of anything in return. Something simpler than that. Something that didn't require light to navigate by. "Can I tell you something?" he said. She looked at him. "That night on the highway, those 4 seconds before I got out of the truck." He looked at the window. "I almost didn't stop. I was so tired. I told myself you had a phone. Someone was coming. I had every reason to just drive." "I know," she said. "You told me. What I didn't tell you..." He paused. "What I didn't tell you is that the thing that made me get out wasn't anything noble. It was just... I couldn't look at myself the next day if I hadn't. That's all. It was that small." She was quiet. "I'm telling you because I think people make these things sound bigger than they are," he said. "Like there's some moment of clarity, some decision that comes from a place of strength. This wasn't that. I was just a tired, broke person on a bad night who didn't want to be the kind of person who drives past." "That's not small," she said. "It felt small." "Most good things do," she said. "From the inside, when they're happening." He looked at her. She was right. He knew she was right. And he thought that was one of the things he'd keep from this year, this strange, brutal, unplanned year. The way the things that changed your life most completely were never the ones that announced themselves. They came in through the side door. They came in the form of a storm on a highway, or a lawyer saying they're overreaching, or a 6-year-old in flower shoes saying it's yours, or a woman at a corner table who listened like she meant it. They came small and became large slowly, the way things that last always do. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him with the ease of someone who had decided, after enough caution, after enough assessing, that this was the place she wanted to be. Not perfectly. Not with every question answered. Just this. What was actually here? What had been building through the months without either of them naming it until it was already real. "Stay," he said. Not a question, but not a demand either. Just an offering. "I wasn't planning on leaving," she said. They stood in his kitchen, in the house that was slightly too small, and needed the window recaulked, and had Emmy's drawings on the refrigerator, and a second-grade worksheet on the table, and the smell of real pasta in the air. Not perfect. Not the version you designed from the outside, just the actual thing, with all its weight and warmth and accumulated meaning. Outside, Pittsburgh moved through its September night. The river was where it always was. The streets were lit the way they always were. Not beautifully, just adequately, the way functional things are lit. The garage was locked up and the photographs were on the north wall, and Ray's Buick was parked outside on Route 51, waiting for Tuesday. And somewhere in the city, the printing shop owner who'd written Gerald's number on a card was still fighting and would probably win. And Frank was at home not being afraid of his lease for the first time in a year, and Emmy was in her room with her ocean book open to whatever page she'd left it on. None of it was the story Landon would have told himself a year ago if you'd asked him what his life would look like. He would have told you something smaller and more defensive. He would have told you survival, not this. Not the garage that had grown beyond his father's version, not the woman at his kitchen counter, not the strange and accidental community of people who'd accumulated around a single act of not driving past someone who needed help. He had not set out to build any of this. He had set out on a rainy November night to get home and sleep before Monday's hearing. And he had stopped. That was the whole story, and also only the beginning of it. Some things didn't need to be larger than that to be enough. Some things, the right things, were large enough already by the simple fact of being true. He turned the kitchen light down. The house held them.